Hello, everyone. So I'm going to call the meeting to order at 6 p.m. Can I get an approval of the agenda? Moved by Councillor Tozo, seconded by Councillor Stevens. All in favor? That passes. There's no confirmation of the minutes because there are no minutes. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Huh? And can we keep it down in the room too? Thanks. So are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing as none. Okay, so we have delegations. So we have Mary Farrar, who will be present to speak to the committee regarding update on the Kingston Inner Harbor Contaminated Sediment Management Plans report. So you have 5 minutes.
Okay, can you hear all right? I would like a 1-minute warning because rather than a 30-second because I haven't really got myself organized today. And I'm going to try and be as brief as I can. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak here, and part of my delegation is Peter Hodgson, who is via Zoom, and you're free to ask questions of him after my delegation as well. He is a world-class ecotoxicologist. He has just co-authored a book published by the Cambridge University Press called Ecotoxicology. And so with respect to the consultants, I do feel that he is really the knowledgeable one about any questions you might have about contamination, particularly with fish. So I'm going to, I have 6 points, and I hope you've all had time to read my submission because it is quite detailed. But I will go over the 6 major concerns that I have and hope that you might have further questions about it. So the first one is that we believe that there should absolutely be no dredging. We're grateful that Golder Consultants has come halfway and reduced the amount of dredging that they initially suggested by quite a bit. But the 6 Queen's professors that are part of our science subgroup, each one of them has said no dredging. Dredging will cause more problems than it will solve, potentially. And, you know, garbage happens. And no matter what the engineers say, yes, it'll all be clean and perfect and everything will work out well. Well, dredging's a messy business. So that's just a bit of background, like 6 Queen's professors, environmental science, earth sciences, biology, geography, and chemical engineering. Okay, so no dredging should happen. Why? Because the risk to humans is completely negligible. Golder Consultants, now WSP, have said that there is a moderate risk to humans, and therefore the dredging is needed. Well, the only 2 pathways to human suffering is 1, eating the fish, and there is already a fish advisory in place, or 2, ingesting through the skin, which would require walking barefoot for 2 hours in the sediments, and that doesn't happen. And if, as part of their consulting work, they had actually done a survey of past, present, and future uses of the Inner Harbor, they would have seen that people don't go do that. They might get in and out of a kayak barefoot. But the environment is not conducive to swimming, walking. It is weedy. It is just simply non-inviting. And the risk to habitat is great. In their report, they barely really look at turtles, and turtles we know are a major, major issue in the Inner Harbor. So that's the first item. The second one, capping. Now, we're also against capping because some of the Queen's profs have said, well, they haven't given adequate rationale for why capping should be in certain areas, why it should be one depth rather than another depth. And sometimes they say it should be mixed with organic material, but it's all very vague. And so really, honestly, best left alone. Now, I'm just going to add one thing. This whole procedure of selling off water lots started out, I believe, in the Harper area. I may be wrong with that. And it was a good idea. Like, it brought in money coffers for the federal government. Sell off all these water lots that are no longer useful. Okay. So I trust you have my thing. Timing concerns. They're concerned with PAHs and PCBs. If they get rid of the legacy contaminants, they still come in because of pharmaceuticals coming in the storm sewer. So why do that first? Get rid of the contaminants there, and also deal with the tannery and deal with the ownership issue that is yet unsolved. I would like the money to be spent on naturalized shoreline. I would like the money to be spent hiring Joyce Hostin to do different kinds of plants at all 4 levels of the shoreline. That would be awesome, and that would discourage people from going out there. So Jeffrey Jackaman has spoken clearly to the previous council. He is a chemical engineering prof.
Thank you very much. That's your 5 minutes.
He's amazing.
Thank you.
And he says, okay, please ask.
So is there any questions from the committee?
Yes.
Councillor Stephen?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. If you were going to finish that thought, what would you say?
I'm sorry, I haven't got my hearing aids. Can you speak up?
If you were going to finish that thought, what would you say?
Thank you. So Jeffrey Jackaman is an expert in water flow patterns, and he did give a report to the previous council, and the previous council was quite disturbed because he's this editor of Flow magazine and reads 3,000 papers a year on water flow. Water comes down the Great Cataraqui River, and contrary to public opinion, it goes west. Water goes in mysterious ways. It goes west past Lake Ontario Park, and then it veers south to Rochester in New York State, and then it goes down the St. Lawrence. So he lives out in Old Front Road. He says there's no way, if dredging happens, that he would go swimming or trust the city of Kingston's water, because inevitably some of this will get suspended. And I know the environmental sciences group, Ken Reimer, poo-pooed it and said, oh, well, who's he? But the history of science is full of scientists who disagree with one another because they get locked into their worldviews. And in fact, Jeffrey Jackaman is the expert. And I don't know what city lawyers would say if something happened to the city's water. I mean, all sorts of lawsuits could happen, let alone problems. And so the final point is that they want the city to contribute $10 million, and the city can use $10 million in many better ways than this. Nature is doing a pretty good job. Leave it to nature. It knows what it's doing. It's burying the chemicals very, very successfully for the most part. And, you know, they sold, the Dornicamps bought the contaminated coal dock for $1. Why? What about selling this for $1? I don't know, maybe Metalcraft might be interested, but, you know, this project should simply not go ahead in its current state.
Councillor Osanek?
Councillor Stephen basically asked the question I was going to ask. Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions? No, see as none. Thank you very much.
Finished?
So now we'll move on to briefings. So can I invite Paul McClatchy, Environment Director, and Tara Yokyung Hope from Transport Canada, Gary Lawrence, Oh, Gary Lawrence from WSP and Valerie Menelga from Parks Canada, who will speak to the committee regarding the update on Kingston's Inner Harbor Contaminated Sediment Management Plans report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and committee members. Kingston, as everyone knows, has an industrial history that unfortunately is recorded in the river sediments of the Cataraqui River. The majority of the Inner Harbor is federally owned, so it's no surprise that Transport Canada and Parks Canada have built upon the significant investigation and risk assessment work done by Kingston Environmental Advisory Forum and then RMC, and they have proposed a project that's going to address environmental risks within the Inner Harbor. This is not a city project, it's a federal initiative, but the city has an interest in it because the city owns some of the water lots where sediment contamination poses some risk. In 2021, the federal government provided the city, through this committee, with details of their proposed sediment remediation project. There was considerable public interest and concern at that time, and that remains. They have since undertaken significant consultation with local interest groups and citizens and are here tonight to present their revised proposal for managing contaminated sediments within the Inner Harbor and to support staff's recommendation for the city to continue discussions on how city-owned water lots might be included into this federal project. Tonight's briefing will be provided by Tara Yoakum-Hope of Transport Canada, Valerie Menelga of Parks Canada, and Gary Lawrence of WSP Canada. And I'd like to hand the floor over to them, please, to introduce their team. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pass things over to David Brighton at Parks first, just to give a few opening remarks for the project team.
Thanks, Tara, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to make this presentation. Just by way of introductions, I'm David Britton. I'm the Director of Ontario Waterways for Parks Canada, so I'm responsible for the management of the Rideau Canal and the Trent Severn Waterway. We're happy to be back here at EITP. We last presented on this project about 2.5 years ago in September of 2021. At that time, the project was in a fairly early conceptual stage, and we presented the first draft of the sediment management plan. Since that time, the project team has focused on Indigenous and public engagement, and that includes a wide range of one-on-one meetings, web contact, and virtual information sessions, as well as conducting more research to collect baseline information. Through that consultation process, we received extensive feedback that's resulted in changes and improvements on the plan, particularly around nature-based solutions for shoreline protection. We really have appreciated the level of community involvement and interest and the time that the stakeholder organizations have taken to participate in the process. And we firmly believe that that input will result in a much better ecologically sensitive design. We still have a long way to go in this project. The next steps are to conduct a detailed environmental impact assessment and begin the detailed design process. At the earliest, construction would not start on this project until 2027. So our objective here tonight is to provide an update in terms of the status of the project, including the stakeholder and Indigenous engagement that we've carried out, some of the study results, how the sediment management plan has changed based on the input we've got so far, and what the next steps in the process are, and the future opportunities for stakeholder input. So we also hope to receive support from council members to continue the dialogue that we've been having with city staff who carry a lot of knowledge and expertise about the site, and to continue the collaborative approach to this project with them. So thank you for the time, and I will turn it over to Tara to begin the presentation.
Thank you, David. My name is Tara Yoakum-Hope. I'm a Regional Senior Environmental Advisor for Transport Canada and the Project Manager for Transport Canada on this file. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the purpose of today's meeting is really to share an updated project information with the City of Kingston on our Inner Harbor project and highlight some of the updates that we've made to our conceptual sediment management plan for the site. The goal of the project is to reduce chemical risks to humans and the ecological receptors through the management of sediment. This is important that we're balancing and ensuring the protection of wildlife habitats and sensitive species, archaeology and infrastructure, and other valued features while we manage this sediment. It is important to note that while the project hasn't had many years of data collection and study, We are still very early in the remedial planning stages, and we are open to feedback as we proceed into design in 2024. As David mentioned, we hope to continue to work with city staff as we move into this detailed design phase. Next slide, please. Today's presentation will cover some background information, results of previous studies, and highlights that update that we've made to the conceptual sediment management plan for the site. We'll talk about the impact assessment process, the current status of the project, and again, the key steps moving forward. Next slide, please. The site has been contaminated by a history of industrial activity in or near the harbor, including coal gasification, tannery and smelter operations, manufacturing, fabrication mills, landfills, shipyards, fuel depots, and rail yards. These industrial activities have led to contamination of metals like chromium, arsenic, and mercury, as well as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, and polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. This very long and complex history limits our ability to pursue these original polluters, and the federal government has accepted liability for its water lots and has begun planning for the management of these contaminated sediments. It's important to know that many of these legacy sources have been evaluated and been confirmed not to be ongoing sources of contamination for the harbor. We are, however, making sure that other potential sources, such as municipal storm sewers, are properly assessed to minimize the potential for recontamination post-project. Next slide, please. You can just move to the next slide, please. Thank you. The project area, as shown on this figure, for sediment management is located in the harbor, and it's bound by the LaSalle Causeway to the south and Bell Island to the north. The water lots are administered by Parks Canada in the north and Transport Canada in the south, and there are some small portions that fall under the jurisdiction of the City of Kingston and the Department of National Defense. On the figure, you'll see that the purple markings depict areas of highest contamination, while the hatched area shows areas with elevated contamination levels above what you would typically expect to see in a working harbor. It's important to note that over time, we've been able to reduce the size of the area requiring active management. We've been able to screen out the entire eastern half of the inner harbor from needing any intervention, as it shows similar sediment quality to reference conditions north of Bell Island. And for a substantial portion of the western half of the harbor, monitored natural recovery is indeed the plan. Next slide, please. In 2021, we had provided a presentation to the EITP committee on the initial sediment management plan for the inner harbor, and we received recommendations and feedback for refinement on that 2021 plan. We sought feedback from stakeholders on the plan and documented this feedback in a What We Heard report. This What We Heard report is available on the project website, and you can download that report to have a summary of all of the feedback we've obtained over the last few years. The federal government has been and continues to engage and consult on a nation-to-nation basis with Indigenous communities, separately from the public engagement activities that are documented in this What We Heard report. Next slide, please. From 2021 to 2022, we updated the Kingston Inner Harbor website with additional information on the project, and we conducted a virtual public information session from August to October of 2022. This session provided the public with an overview of the project, video presentations on various topics related to Kingston Inner Harbor, and an opportunity to provide comment on the report. Feedback provided by Indigenous communities, local stakeholders, and the public has been taken into consideration, and as we've drafted and updated the 2023 sediment management plan, we're here to talk to you tonight about. In February and March of 2024, we've held meetings on the revised conceptual plans with Kingston Field Naturalists, Friends of Kingston Inner Harbor, and Bell Island Caretaker Circle. We're planning future meetings with Turtles Kingston and River First, and meetings are also being held with Indigenous communities. Also to note, we're planning to update the website to highlight the changes made to the revised plan, along with an updated frequently asked questions page. Next slide, please. There were a number of key themes and questions that were raised during the previous engagement period. These are summarized again at a high level in the What We Heard report, which is available on our website. A few of the key questions we've received to date have focused on questions on potential contamination of drinking water and water bodies during remediation, on historical contamination from past industrial activities, on potential municipal chemical sources to the harbor. There was expressions of interest in incorporating green engineering methods using native species or shoreline habitat enhancements. There's interest in other developments that may be planned in the area, including along the waterfront, and what environmental controls could be put in place to prevent future contamination. This is just a sample of a number of issues and concerns and key themes that we've heard over the last several years. And as David mentioned, we really do appreciate the extensive feedback provided, the level of community involvement, and all of the time taken from stakeholders to date. I think the feedback has resulted in changes and improvements to the SMP, and these will continue to be carefully considered as we move forward into the design phase of this project. I'll pass things over to Gary from WSP to provide more details on the environmental studies and SMP.
Thanks for that. Hopefully you can hear me. Thanks for your time and attention. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Gary Lawrence. I work for WSP. I've worked in the field of aquatic health risk assessment for about 30 years, and about half of that, amazingly, has been on this project. I am the senior author of the federal detailed ecological risk assessment guidance, and I provide training for federal custodians on how to manage contaminated aquatic sites, especially harbors. So if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide, I'm going to pick up where Tara left off. So what I'm going to jump into here, it's a very complex project, so I'm just going to jump right into the thick of it here. One of the questions that came up pretty early in the consultation stage was whether or not nature or natural processes would solve this problem for us, which would obviously be ideal. And recognizing that a number of years had elapsed since we did the risk assessment, we did a pretty detailed mapping of the contaminants throughout the harbor, which you can see on this graphic here. The orange symbols on the graph show the surface, top 5 to 10 centimeter samples, and the yellow locations indicate where we did additional coring. This data set builds upon, obviously, a multitude of studies done over decades of time, but this really helped to update it and provide a consistent way of assessing the current condition. What we found overall, as you'll see in some of the slides that come up, is that unfortunately there has not been noticeable improvement over time, and by time I mean over decades or more in time frame. The general patterns of contamination that we saw 10 to 15 years ago stay in place. Some localized areas that are a little better, and some localized areas that are a little worse, but overall the level of chemical risk remains pretty much as it was since we completed the risk assessment. The concentrations are substantially above guidelines that are used at the screening stage for ecological risk assessment. That doesn't mean that automatically dredging or removal is required, but what it did indicate is need for further investigation, which led to some of the detailed studies that we've done over time. So next slide, please. This is a selection of the contaminants. It's not all of them, but it's a few of the ones that are drivers for the risk management plan. And these plots do reflect updated sediment chemistry. You can see the time frame covers about a decade, but most of those new samples come from sampling done in 2019 or more recent than that. So they are pretty fresh in terms of depicting the current condition of the harbor. For PAHs, which is something that's associated with a number of industrial activities, but especially the creosote and coal gasification sources in downtown Kingston history. The primary source is now obviously gone, but there's what we would describe as a secondary source where sediments and materials that were deposited in Anglin Bay or at the mouth of Anglin Bay have remained. Some of them are buried at depth, and they continue to be remobilized and in some cases actually spread out into other areas of the harbor. So this is the area where not only have things not got better, but they, if anything, have shown spread of contaminants, which you can see in the orange portion of that graph. Just because the legend's really small, I'll just quickly give an overview of what these colors mean. The warmer or hotter the color, the greater the level of chemical contamination. And the levels that are orange or worse are the ones that have been made the priority for some of the remediation plans. There's also PAHs up in the north end next to the former municipal landfill. Those are being managed from a source control perspective, but again, there's a legacy of sediment contamination that has not been buried sufficiently, has not degraded sufficiently, and frankly shows no signs of improving demonstrably over time. The middle category here is for a completely different class of contaminants. The PCBs are associated primarily with the landfill to the north, where you can see that there's some orange and red. That, again, has been controlled by source controls that the city of Kingston has implemented to prevent further inputs of PCBs, but you can see that there's a fair section of the shoreline there that is substantially above guidelines, and spots of PCBs in some other areas. We don't propose to go after all of them. There are sections of the middle of the harbor for which it would be close to impossible to target, delineate, and remove PCBs. And then finally, chromium. This is the feature metal for the site, obviously associated with the tannery legacy and brownfield issues. It can be alarming to see the red, but because this chromium is present predominantly in the trivalent form, it's not as bad as is conveyed by the bright red. That said, there is still risk predicted for chromium when you're in that maximum zone of chromium contamination in the northwest portion of the harbor. The rest of the harbor doesn't indicate that, like in the middle of the harbor, for example, that does not indicate need for physical intervention for chromium specifically. We haven't shown it on the map here, but there were also comparisons done to background contamination. So we've compared quality in these industrially exposed locations to areas.
You cut out a bit.
That are upstream of Bevel, typical urban contamination. And our concentrations are substantially above those in these areas that are a warm color on the graphs. The last thing before I depart this slide, we don't have time to go through the details of all of the tools used, but I'll just emphasize that chemistry is only one tool in the risk assessment toolbox, as indicated in that brown circle. A lot of other tools were brought to bear on this project. Some of those entail biological assessments, looking at the communities and whether they're abundant and rich. Some are based on laboratory work, such as standardized Environment Canada sediment toxicity tests, which are used as a diagnostic for the health of communities exposed to contaminated sediment. And then also bioaccumulation lines of evidence. These are the things that relate to tissue uptake of chemicals like, next slide. Okay, so where we're at in the management strategy is what we're calling a sediment management plan. We have only barely scratched the surface of detailed design. So this SMP reflects conceptual design. It doesn't reflect all the details, nor could it, because information on critical habitats and infrastructure and other things that weren't considered at the conceptual stage hadn't been previously incorporated. Just now we're beginning to include a lot of those considerations. And because of that, we will expect changes to the, what I'll call the footprint of intervention in different areas. Another point I want to make is that this is not a one-size-fits-all project. It is not a case of deciding whether to proceed or not, nor is it a case of whether to dredge or not. It's really about identifying the best solution for different portions of the site, which we call management units. So the updates that we've seen in the last year and a half, and that we will continue to see as the detailed impact assessment results are crystallized, we'll keep seeing changes. We'll keep seeing refinements to the scale of where woody debris is placed or where a cap thickness is modified. But the conceptual SMP that's available for download, it doesn't yet include all of those components. There will be an opportunity for consultation and stakeholder engagement on upcoming iterations of design. So this is not the end of the line in terms of consultation. Next slide. Okay, so this is that conceptual SMP layout. I'm going to quickly walk through these color codes. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but let's just start with what often gets missed in the summary of this project, which is that central area with the blue cover, the blue shading, that represents what we call monitored natural recovery. And that does not require dredging, capping, intrusive works of any kind. We're effectively saying that although those areas are not pristine, they may have some low-level risk, that risk doesn't rise to the level that would require management intervention. And in that regard, we're in agreement with other stakeholders that have identified the balancing of different considerations in sediment management. So that's quite a large area. That area has shrunk over time. It has become less intrusive over time. And that's the way that these projects typically work. You start conservative, and then you shrink the amount of intervention with each iteration. The areas that are what I'll call physical intervention are the green and the yellow. The green is, for the most part, dredging, so excavation, removal with backfilling of inert clean material. And the yellow areas are thin layer capping, which is a thin layer of clean sediment, and in some cases, extra things are added to the sediment to help bind contaminants and make them less available to organisms in the harbor. The exact configuration of the cap will vary, but in general terms, that's what the yellow means. The orange to the bottom is Anglin Bay, and Anglin Bay is a bit special because that is a location where, unfortunately, a lot of creosote-like materials, or what's called DNAPL, was discharged. And we can continue to see streaks and layers of heavy contamination by this material within Anglin Bay. And over time, it has spread. It's heterogeneous, so it's mixed throughout the sediment. Sometimes it's at the surface, sometimes it's at depth, sometimes it's both. But because of that challenge, we want to eliminate that source long term. And for that reason, we're proposing to excavate to greater depth in Anglin Bay and to backfill with a fairly thick cover to make sure that mixing and bioturbation does not release those hydrocarbons back to the environment. The pink and red areas, these reflect offsets or naturalized zones within the project. There's different kinds of offset. So for example, Bell Island will have at least a 40-meter offset shown in pink around that island. In other parts of the harbor, depending on the nature of the shoreline, there will be areas that are physically undisturbed in terms of dredging or capping, but will still have modification of the shoreline. And some of those modifications can actually be enhancements of habitat, depending on what you do with the grain size of material, the incorporation of woody debris, select plants. There's a number of tools that are available that can actually enhance habitat in portions of the harbor. So those are shown in the red hatched areas. You can see them along Woolen Mill area and along Douglas Fleur Park. And then finally, up at the top, there's that blue area. Hopefully you can see the PCOM. This is a handle with care area because it has portions that are actually marsh, that have cattail marsh along the southern end. It's provincially significant wetland around that area. Much of that area is covered by water lilies. This area is going to be treated with greater level of care in terms of the fragility of the biological resources there. Unlikely to have the dredging and capping type technology as the lead, much more likely to have thin layer amendments and shoreline natural type approaches. There are some approaches specifically developed for wetlands that can be considered in that area, but it's delicate and we don't yet have a detailed plan for that area. So that's the update as of, I can't even say today, because even as of today, there are changes ongoing. As an example, in TC4, where you see there's dredging along that green area, we've identified shipwrecks there that probably preclude dredging. So we're already modifying the footprint to account for those cultural features of value. And there's some other changes as well that will be minor refinements to what you see on this graphic. Okay, I think next slide is due. Okay, so I've covered off some of these. The point I really want to make here is that multiple strategies can be combined even within one management unit. Certainly it will not be one size fits all across the whole harbor, but even within management units, combinations of these tools can be applied effectively. Dredging is most appropriate for the chemical hotspots to make sure that those chemicals do not continue to spread and resuspend and spread throughout the harbor, which is what they have done for half a century or more, is slowly move around the harbor. The capping can be customized so that you only apply thick caps where needed, avoid unnecessary thicknesses of caps, and apply materials that help to reduce exposure to organisms. There's a substance called activated carbon. This connects to the third column of this figure, where materials can be placed in the sediment bed that absorb pHs, PCBs, and other constituents. So even though they're not removed, their propensity to go into the aquatic food web is reduced. And this has been demonstrated in both harbor contexts and in wetlands. The fourth is the nature-based shoreline rehabilitation. There's a number of terms for it. Some people call it green engineering. But what we're really talking about here is striking a balance between reducing exposure to shoreline receptors from a chemical standpoint, but doing so in a way that is non-intrusive and that pays a lot of attention to the habitat values. I've mentioned a few of the things like the diameter of substrate used along the shoreline. That is used to prevent shoreline erosion, but depending on the configuration of the sizes of cobbles, pebbles, sand, and other things, you can contour the shoreline in a way that protects the shoreline, but also provides habitat value. There are specific things done in terms of fine scale enhancements of habitats, which we don't have time for today. We have some design drawings that the landscape architects have put together. And what they basically show is that there's this zone of non-dredging, non-thick capping that has multiple sculpting techniques used to do things like make a slope more gentle, use natural woody debris, use plantings, and so forth. So it's a complex project, but it will be customized to the conditions that are present along each section of shoreline. And then finally, as I highlighted earlier, the monitored natural recovery shouldn't be ignored. Quite a large section has been set for monitored natural recovery. That doesn't mean zero risk. Leaving those areas probably does slow the long-term rate at which beneficial use impairments can be resolved. Fisheries advisories will likely remain in place for a long time, but our team did not believe that the trade-off was worthwhile to apply physical remediation in those large areas in the center of the harbor. Next slide. Oversimplification, but some of the questions that have come up have been around source control, including today. So obviously lots of legacy sources, as you saw from Tara's presentation. Many studies have been done looking at these major point sources or brownfield or legacy industrial projects. And for the most part, those have been effectively controlled. So this project is not really about needing to do extensive studies of leaching or recontamination of the harbor. What we have done recently, though, is we have begun confirmatory studies around known or suspected point sources and looking at sediment and water conditions in those areas so that we don't miss an opportunity if something surprising is found. But for the most part, these looking at is the secondary pathway where material that is belched out into the harbor is being redistributed by winds, waves, and natural sediment transport processes. This is a working harbor, so the goal here is not to create a pristine environment. Storm sewers will continue to be part of the harbor as they are in all major cities in the Great Lakes area. These evaluations of the Kings Court sewer and some of the other storm sewers along the shoreline will help provide confidence that we are addressing the dominant sources of contaminants and that there's no new sources that will undermine the effectiveness of the ongoing plan. The sediment management plan also has a number of requirements for broad scale management of the harbor. So it assumes that the source controls that have been implemented will be maintained, if not improved, like the protection of the Bell Park landfill leachate collection, which Paul McClatchy can describe for you if you're interested. And there's other kinds of sources that have been controlled through placements of barriers and containment and soil excavations. There's all kinds of things that have been done. And so the main thing to protect our project from being recontaminated would be to watch for erosion control disruptions along the shoreline, especially in areas where you have the highest concentrations of contaminants. I've talked about storm sewer management. Paul, again, could probably give you a breakdown about how the city managed their storm sewers. We've only done one round of storm sewer monitoring with a couple more planned, so it's preliminary to give a really detailed answer, but so far we haven't identified anything that would substantively change our plan. I think one more slide before I turn it back to the federal team. Okay, so ongoing site condition studies. I mentioned all of that work done in 2019 and some in more recent years to confirm the current condition of sediments. That does a couple of things. First of all, it validates the distribution of contamination from earlier studies, and it also provides a baseline against which improvements can be compared after a project. The surface water quality study, same thing, looking at water quality in the main contaminated portion of the harbor and also upstream at a reference condition to establish that baseline. That's very important for establishing the environmental management plan that will be part of the overall project implementation. And then probably the biggest source of ongoing condition studies are biological in nature. I mentioned early on that the design at the conceptual stage gave a fairly rudimentary discussion of habitats because we didn't have the details of some of the ecological communities that we needed, especially along the shoreline. That work is ongoing. Field studies planned for this summer and for the winter. We've been taking in information as well on things like archaeological results. So more data, more refinements expected in response to those studies, and overall a refinement of the detailed design over time. These studies, in many cases, are going to actually make it into the detailed impact assessment. I'll leave it to the federal contributors to discuss schedule later, but the detailed impact assessment provides the main state of understanding of the current condition, what is vulnerable, what needs to be taken into consideration in the design of the project. So it's a pretty important project milestone. And the field studies that I just described are a big part of that. And I think that might be it to turn over back to the federal team. Can you just advance to the next slide?
Yeah, so
Yes,
thanks, Gary. I think those are my slides now. So Valerie Manelga, I'm the Parks Canada project lead on this team and the manager of environmental services for the Rideau and the Trent Severn Waterway National Historic Sites. So my team's actually split between both systems. I've been with Parks for 17 years now and have been doing impact assessment and resource conservation, resource management projects throughout my career here at Parks Canada. So like Gary said, a lot of this presentation so far has been on what we've been doing over the last 2.5 years through the conceptual stage process. Really, the impact assessment process on the federal side typically starts during detailed design. So unlike a municipal class EA that will happen at the conceptual stage and look at options, the federal process is really focused on mitigating those details when we get in the detailed design process, and then assessing or ensuring that there's no significant adverse effects before we kind of move to completing design and implementation. The Parks Canada process is also a little bit different from general federal impact assessments or major projects that you might see with the Impact Assessment Agency. It is really focused about setting desired outcomes for valued components, so those sensitive features, whether they're natural or cultural, at the start of the project. So identifying those valued components or those sensitive features, setting the desired outcome of what we would like to see once the project's complete, and then setting thresholds and targets before the project so that once we're completed, we can actually evaluate that we've met those desired outcomes and that those mitigation measures have been effective in reducing or eliminating those potential environmental impacts. In Parks Canada's process, the detailed impact assessment is really the highest level of assessment in our impact assessment process. It typically sets out a terms of reference for the process, so kind of equivalent to a scoping document, which does typically align with this conceptual stage where the sediment management plan is at. So as part of this project, we've actually called it a conceptual constraints and impacts considerations document. It's actually a bit of an expanded terms of reference, which goes into a bit more detail of those desired outcomes thresholds, and then potential constraints or considerations that were set at this conceptual stage as we move into detailed design. So that document is available on the website along with that What We Heard report and the sediment management plan. It is a rather large document. It was done about almost 6 months to a year ago now. I would highlight that the most important part is really those tables in there that highlights those valued components, thresholds, and outcomes in the tables themselves. If you can move to the next slide, please. So at the time, like I said, that the CCIC was done, we were still at the conceptual stage, and there were a number of gaps that still needed to be completed through the additional baseline studies that Gary highlighted, as well as detailed design. So we won't actually finalize that CCIC document that is on the website, but more the information that we've gathered since that document was completed, or additional concerns or valued components that might not be in there, will get rolled directly into the detailed impact assessment. So it is a good document to look at, but kind of the next draft or version will be the full impact assessment itself, which we're targeting for about 66% detailed design, so sometime later this fall. We're still finalizing that schedule, so that's the estimated timeline right now. So once we move into the detailed impact assessment stage and we have that detailed design, the impact assessment will really do that full evaluation in terms of what are the potential environmental effects, what are the mitigations that we need to minimize it. A lot of those have already kind of fed into this conceptual stage and early design process, but that's where that list will be composed. And then those will move into an environmental management plan, which will really have on those ground details. So, where something like a sediment fence might go, exactly where dewatering and how dewatering will happen in terms of contaminated sediments. As my colleagues have already stated, we're still very much in the early design process. So there will be kind of a next formal stage in the impact assessment for an additional milestone in terms of feedback, but really stakeholder engagement will continue throughout this process. I think Gary's hit on most of the information gaps on the previous slide, but there is still a couple projects or a couple surveys that need to be completed. Additional information collected on turtle overwintering sites, as Mary articulated and as we've heard from other stakeholders and through some of the environmental assessments on the site or baseline surveys. Turtles are a major part of the Inner Harbor and a sensitive feature that's recognized at this conceptual level of the SMP, but will also feed into the DIA. And so we're conducting additional studies to try and refine where some of that turtle overwintering activity might be happening in the Inner Harbor over the next year. Some of the gaps that were in that CCIC also included assessing greenhouse gas emissions that might occur as part of the project, incorporating climate change considerations, so things like temperature, increased storm events, some of the things you might have heard when talking about climate change in this area, as well as sediment conditions, and then refining the hydraulic and processes in the Inner Harbor. Some of the documents that are on the website are really at that early conceptual stage. And so some of the details and questions that have been raised will really be answered over the next year. You can go to the next slide. So just kind of overview of where we are in terms of the overall project planning. So we're in this early 2024 year, which is really at the start of that detailed design process, and then going into kind of the formal detailed impact assessment process. Like David said at the beginning, we're still a long way from implementation, and there's still a number of opportunities for public feedback. We've really heard what's been said over the last 2.5 years and really refined the design, the conceptual design to address some of those concerns, especially with that shoreline enhancement and habitat preservation. And like Gary said, I'm sure there will continue to be additional refinements as we go through the detailed design process, but also from the results of the impact assessment itself, which will look at some of those questions that have been raised around how do we mitigate some of those impacts to the environment. You can go to the next slide. So as was mentioned, a lot of this information is on the Kingston Inner Harbor website, and we will be updating the presentations that are on there with the updates, highlighting the updates to the sediment management plan, and then updating the FAQs for some of the questions and comments that we've heard over especially the last few months as we've re-engaged on this revised conceptual plan. There are a couple formal opportunities still, like I mentioned, in the public engagement process, particularly as we get to that 66% detailed design and a draft on the impact assessment. So like I said, likely later this fall in 2024. If you move to the next slide. So just to recap some of the things that you've heard tonight, the plan that was shared with stakeholders in the fall and presented tonight is really still at that conceptual stage. It has incorporated a lot of the feedback that we've heard from Indigenous communities, stakeholders, other regular authorities, and part of the general public engagement that we did in 2022. Overall, the footprint of physical, so active intervention has been reduced compared to the previous concept. This plan is also a stage remediation, so all the work won't be happening in a single season. We're still at a very high level conceptual stage for some of those restricted timing windows of when we can do in-water work in order to protect the environment, wildlife, fish, turtles. So that means that the work will be conducted over multiple years or multiple seasons. So right now, roughly estimated from 2027 to 2030, but that then allows for a staged approach to have some refugia as we move through this implementation project. Like Gary mentioned, we've incorporated dredging exclusion zones along the shoreline, often where some of those sensitive features are for things like turtle basking logs, vegetation in that riparian zone or ribbon of life zone is really important. And so we've focused on the nature-based solutions and actually gone a bit beyond where the conceptual plan is proposing to actually enhance some of those natural features that have been lost along some parts of the Inner Harbor. We really hope that this presentation has served to summarize the update of what's been happening over the last 2.5 years. I know that seems like it's been quite a bit of time, but we are still very much at the conceptual stage and still have a ways to go before that implementation begins. So we'll continue to take the feedback and comments through this process. And like others have mentioned, I've really appreciated the feedback and level of investment that we've seen from stakeholder groups to really, I think, make this design and a better project overall. So if you go to the next slide. So we're really hoping that after tonight, we can continue to engage with city staff throughout this next stage of the project, moving into detailed design, and then hopefully eventually into the implementation stage. I hope to continue the dialogue with the City of Kingston about the inclusion of the city-owned water lots into the overall sediment management plan. And we sincerely appreciate the time for the presentation tonight. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was quite informative. So now I'll move to questions from the committee. Are there any questions? Councillor Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. I'm just wondering, you touched on the sources of contamination, still stuff happening with respect to the land. You probably already know there is a significant part of the land there, the old Davis Tannery, that is at the Ontario Land Tribunal. I'm wondering, is waiting for that, like how is that going to impact your plans? We don't know the outcome yet, of course.
Yes, thank you for that question. So right now, we are aware that the Davis Tannery is in the tribunal. The plan, as it outlines right now, is not dependent on those upland projects. It doesn't rely solely on the outcomes of the Davis Tannery, and is really focused on reducing the chemical risk present in the inner harbor while balancing those ecological and sensitive features. I think I'll pass this question to Gary, who's our risk toxicology expert, to get into a bit more detail about that.
Yeah, just building on what Valerie said, that's the approach. We agree that it's premature to make any sweeping assumptions about the future status of that property, so that that's not built into the sediment management plan, but there are some studies being done to evaluate conditions of highest potential for erosion. For example, we are developing study designs to measure concentrations in the unnamed creek that drains the north part of the wetland, and that will provide useful information to guide the soil erosion control programs for multiple parties. So that area, especially to the north, actually has multiple land jurisdictions. In addition to the federal and brownfield ownership, there's also City of Kingston management of those zones. So the information that we collect on water quality and suspended sediments entering that creek will be valuable for long-term management of those shoreline soils and sediments, no matter what happens with the development plans for the marsh.
I just add to Gary's too, we still have a couple of years to go in the design, as the implementation is planned to start at the earliest in the 2027. So the process that we're under will continue to be an adaptive management approach. So that could include changes and updates to the plan as that development status and upgraded source control decisions are made. So the plan that we're developing now can change based on the outcomes of those decisions.
And since this project has been an ongoing, has been a project for quite some time, we started those investigations almost over 20 years ago now. And now that following the federal contaminated sites process, now that we've identified that risk potential to the environment and human health, now that that liability has been recorded as part of the process, it's gone to other federal departments named expert support under the federal contaminated site process. So it's been reviewed by Health Canada, Environment Canada and Climate Change, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, or DFO. Now that that liability is actually booked related to the federal contaminated sites, and a risk remediation plan has been articulated. We do need to move forward to address those risks that have been identified over the last 20 years. So, like others have mentioned, we do have time to adapt, but as part of that liability identification, we do need to move forward with the project overall.
Thank you. One other question that I have is, what would happen with the project if the city were to choose not to participate? Would it carry on? Would it just exclude city-owned lands? What would happen?
Yeah, we certainly believe that a harbor-wide approach is important for the sediment management plan for the overall project success. But at this time, we're not seeking the city's approval for a project implementation partnership. Our focus really now is to continue to work with the city and participate in the design process in 2024 and into 2025. This participation we feel is important to ensure that the federal sediment management plans align with the City of Kingston's waterfront plan and any shoreline improvement plans that the city may have. And it'll give us a basis to explore what an implementation partnership could look like in the future that might be beneficial to all water lot managers while creating a project that does reduce the overall chemical risk in an ecologically sensitive manner. So yeah, the harbor-wide approach is important, but right now we're just looking at the design phase and the city's participation in that phase.
Hey, Councillor Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. You had mentioned the dredging techniques that you plan on using through this. Are there other examples in the Great Lakes where this has been utilized, and there are municipalities obviously with water filtration systems? Has this ever been affected in any other municipalities that you're aware of with this type of technique?
So from a Parks Canada perspective, we're actually quite familiar with dredging and waterworks projects and some of the standard environmental mitigation measures that might be proposed as we go through detailed design. So things like turbidity curtains are something that we're quite familiar with. We've actually refined some of the requirements for turbidity curtains across some of our central Ontario sites. The third crossing project, so the Waban crossing just north of the Inner Harbour, has also fed into some local site-specific information where it comes to in-water turbidity control. I'm not sure if Gary mentioned it in the presentation, but the water quality itself in the Inner Harbour is quite good. And a lot of the risk is of those contaminants are actually bound to the sediment itself. So when we're talking construction and dredging, we're really talking about containing any of those sediments that might get resuspended during any of those management activities, whether it's dredging or capping or shoreline intervention. And things like turbidity curtains, things like capture and dewatering of sediments are actually quite well understood. And we'll be incorporating a lot of those lessons learned from the Waban crossing in our own project as we move through detailed design. As part of the impact assessment and detailed design process, we'll actually be setting site-specific water quality criteria in order to actually link during construction, what are those thresholds that we need to set that we can monitor live during construction. So that's often turbidity, which can be taken by construction or environmental oversight as part of the project. And those turbidity levels will actually be linked directly to what the potential contamination concentrations might be when that sediment gets resuspended. So I don't have exact numbers right now, but that's something that we're working on over the next year. That then will lead to into the environmental management plan that contractors will actually have to bid on as part of this project. And those kind of robust environmental controls will actually form part of the bid package that contractors have to bid on, so that they're aware and they take into account during the construction process some of these more rigorous environmental controls that will be required. In terms of water intakes, we do have some experience in terms of in-water work near municipal water intakes. We'll often work with the municipality to understand what type of water treatment plant they have. Some, have additional treatment requirements above certain turbidity levels. That is something we're familiar with and will take into account as part of the detailed design. But part of the impact assessment as well is going to look at some of those specific hydrology factors. So the Inner Harbor, I know it was mentioned earlier in this meeting, hydraulics are a little bit different. We will be undertaking more detailed modeling as part of detailed design and the impact assessment. But the Inner Harbor does, especially on that west side, does tend to kind of circulate within the Inner Harbor itself. So you'll have the specific controls to contain any potential turbidity or resuspension in the work itself. But then the kind of nature of the impact of the Inner Harbor itself keeps things contained to that west side. And then we'll have that kind of downstream monitoring past the LaSalle Causeway to ensure that we know exactly what's happening if, let's say, there's a curtain failure and there's a plume of sediment, to know how much concentration is that sediment live in terms of how far downstream it's going, and then have those adaptive management controls so that we can then actually, as part of that work, adapt on the fly. There are also strict controls in place usually for these contracts to shut down work if we're passing any of those thresholds. So that's just based on my general experience, but these are the kind of things that'll happen over the next year.
There are a number of large-scale dredging projects, environmental dredging projects that have taken place within the Great Lakes. Hamilton Harbor, the Randall Reef site, is an ongoing project that's being undertaken with Environment Canada and PSPC as the contracting authority there. Peninsula Harbor, these AOC sites, the areas of concern under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements and the Canada-Ontario Agreement. There's Port Hope as well, all different sites that in the Great Lakes where we've had some major environmental dredging. Outside of that too, federally, there's Esquimalt Harbor and Victoria Harbor in BC, which have undertaken some very large-scale sediment management projects, which include dredging. There's certainly a broad range of projects under the federal jurisdiction that have taken place over the last several years.
Thank you for that answer. It was very detailed. You had indicated that in the dredging, that the sediment is monitored when the disturbance takes place, and that you work with the local municipality with their water intake sources. I have concerns about this because we're obviously dredging up a lot of contaminants, and we have a lot of water sources in that area. You have a price tag of $10 million to do this in 2021. It's now 2024. Is the price tag still the same, or are we talking massive scales of inflation now?
Sure. So just, I know I gave a very long answer to the previous question, but I think the takeaway from my answer is that the municipal water intakes are quite far from where the work is happening. And there's a lot of controls that can be put in place to ensure that it doesn't reach the drinking water intakes. In terms of the price tag, the sediment management plan was really based on a generous Class C estimate, which is about plus or minus 50%. As we move through the detailed design process over the next year, at the end of March 2025, we'll have a more refined cost. So at the end of that, we're aiming for a Class A estimate, which is typically plus or minus 5%. So we'll have a better idea of what those costs will look like at the end of this year.
So a Class C estimation at 50%, we're looking at potentially another $5 million, but you did say a Class A will narrow that down a lot more at the end of this study. Is that correct?
Yes, so we should have that refined number by the end of this fiscal year, so in March 2025.
Okay. So our inner harbor obviously has a number of ships that are sitting at the bottom of that lake. What happens with the dredging technique then? Do we just work around it, or do we leave it the way it is?
Yeah, so like Gary mentioned in the presentation, I forget what slide it is, but a lot of those ships are in the Transport Canada water lots closer to Anglin Bay. Over the last 2.5 years, since the last time we were at EITP, we have been doing underwater archaeological work. So we've done a lot of side scan sonar, ground penetrating radar to really try and define the edges and the fields of some of those ships. Some of them have been there quite some time, so they're a larger debris field. And we've been working with our archaeologists, both through the consultant, but also through Parks Canada's archaeologists, who are the federal lead for federal sites when it comes to archaeology, to refine those activities in those management units. And dredging has actually been eliminated in that conceptual plan around a lot of those features. And we've been talking with those archaeologists, and we will through detailed design, to say, how big do the buffer zone have to be around those ships for dredging? How close can we get to those features with things like capping? How thick can that cap be so that it doesn't impact those ships or wrecks in that section of the harbor? The one thing we've heard from archaeologists so far is that the biggest risk, and the thing we won't be doing, is putting any capping material inside those ships, because that's the biggest risks other than the dredge itself. So those specific details are something that we're going to sort out through the detailed design process. And archaeological features is actually one of the valued components in the impact assessment as well. So we'll continue to refine that through this process over the next year.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there fish spawning grounds in that area that should be considered as part of this ecological study?
Yeah, so the inner harbor, although, like Gary mentioned, there are some impairments that can be seen because of the elevated contamination, there is still a lot of ecological values in the inner harbor. So most of the inner harbor itself is fish habitat for all kinds of fish. We've been doing some fish habitat surveys, preliminary ones, over the last 2.5 years. But we're really working on modeling in order to define based on the habitat, what fish are using exactly what spots in those management units across the inner harbor. And then where that habitat might be abundant across the whole inner harbor, outside the area in terms of the spots that aren't being disturbed, and then ensuring that the plan takes into account that there is no net loss for any of those spawning species. Right now, at the very preliminary stage, a lot of those fish are common to the Cataraqui area, so right up to the 401 and Kingston Mills to the mouth of the outer harbor. But that'll continue to get refined as part of the impact assessment. So it is a valued component in that CCIC document that I mentioned on the website, and then the DIA will have specific sections to fish and fish habitat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. You had indicated that it'll take 3 years, 2027 to 2030, to complete the work, but you've also said to do the work it would take 3 years, as in you're phasing it in. Is there a section that you're doing in each of the inner harbor and working your way down towards the causeway, or is that still part of the preliminary work you're working through?
Yeah, so the order of intervention hasn't been identified at this conceptual stage. It will likely be driven by logistics and by some of those timing windows that we spoke about. So things like in water work restrictions to protect fish and fish habitat, turtle overwintering periods, and then trying to identify some water lots that might be less sensitive when it comes to some of those different ecological or potentially sociological or business impacts. So that is something that we're looking at over the next year, and that'll dictate the order of implementation across those different water lots.
So these 3 phases that are being reviewed, implemented, there is maneuverability for each phase to be adjusted as phase 1 is being learned and implemented and brought forward. You're going to learn items of what is taking place. So is there adjustment opportunities for phase 2 and 3?
Yeah, absolutely. There is, generally we follow a principle of adaptive management, but for sure, because in water work might happen for one window in year 1, and then another window in year 2, and another window in year 3, we can definitely adapt and incorporate those lessons learned as we move through the project.
Okay. My last question, you have at the end of your slide deck, 2030 will be the monitoring of after everything is completed. Who is responsible for the monitoring? Is it the municipality or is it Parks Canada?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's actually a point that I missed in the presentation. So the implementation, so that 3 years of implementation where dredging, capping, shoreline stabilization and enhancement is happening isn't the end of the project. So Parks Canada and Transport Canada are still the federal managers for the majority of the water lots, and that federal liability for contaminated sites that I mentioned earlier doesn't disappear at the end of the 3 years. So that monitoring is part of the federal contaminated sites process, but we'll likely also have some post-construction monitoring requirements related to the impact assessment and related to some of those post-construction targets, whether it's in terms of contamination levels, monitoring recovery of aquatic vegetation or fish habitat. So there's 2 kinds of monitoring that'll have to happen over the project. The 10 plus years might extend beyond kind of the immediate post-construction monitoring to how kind of the overall contaminated site has responded to this work, and then some of the items that Gary highlighted in terms of any potential changes to upland features around the inner harbor. That responsibility mainly falls with the federal government, as the majority of those water lots are federally managed.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Councillor Tozo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. First question I have is on Indigenous consultation. It's highlighted throughout the report that Indigenous consultation has taken place and will be an ongoing factor. Can you just elaborate on what that consultation has looked like thus far and what it will look like going forward? Because I know Bell Island is an important part for our Kingston's Indigenous community.
Yeah, so it is handled separately as part of this project. It's not kind of grouped in with stakeholder and public consultation, as the federal government has a duty to consult as part of this project. So we have been engaging with Indigenous communities who have treaty rights in the area or who have interests in the area as well. And that really began even earlier than 2021 when we had the first draft of the conceptual plan. It's involved direct outreach to chief and council. It has involved email and letter communication, and then some presentations directly to those members that chief and council have identified to give that feedback to the federal government. It is ongoing. It will happen throughout part of the process, but those conversations happen kind of at a nation-to-nation level with those individual rights and interest holders for those communities. And then we'll incorporate that feedback into the design process and into the impact assessment as well. We're aware of the co-ownership of Bell Island with the Mohawk Nation Council of Chiefs and have been sending communication and letters to MNCC in addition to some of the Haudenosaunee or Mohawk communities that have treaty rights in the area. We haven't had yet a response from MNCC about Bell Island itself. So some of the reason that Gary mentioned of that 40-meter buffer around Bell Island, some of it's the nature of the contaminants themselves. You know, we don't really have any hotspots right up against Bell Island, but that 40-meter buffer is also meant to respect that potential for Indigenous values around the island itself while we wait to hear back from MNCC. If we don't hear back, the project can proceed with that buffer in place, as those resources on the island will be protected by respecting that buffer. And that buffer has been communicated to some of the Bell Island caretaker circles. I know they are not the rights holders for and co-management of the island itself, but that buffer and that information has been communicated to some of those members as well.
Thank you. Different question. Clearly, dredging and capping isn't new. I would assume we're not the first municipality that's had this. Have there been any negative long-term ramifications for other similar type dredging and capping and cleaning up of harbors that you're aware of? Or has there ever been any negative outcomes for that waterway that you can report on? Because I know long-term monitoring is one of the things that you're going to do in this project, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So some of the pre and post construction monitoring will be a part of the impact assessment and be identified as part of the impact assessment process to define what those are based on those desired outcomes of those sensitive features or valued components. I don't have any specific repercussions or long-term impacts for some of the projects that were named. I'll turn it over to my colleagues in case they do. But that monitoring, the point of the impact assessment is to ensure that based on that site-specific knowledge, based on experience with proven mitigation measure techniques, and then based on uncertainties, that there are no significant adverse environmental effects before we proceed with construction. Through the federal impact assessment process, we cannot proceed if there are significant adverse effects as a result of this project. So that's kind of a key piece that is going to be sorted out through the detailed design over the next year. where there is uncertainty in the project related to some of these valued components, that's where that long-term monitoring and post-construction monitoring will do that follow-up to ensure that our conclusions or our assumptions in the impact assessment have actually played out in the field. Like I said, after the 3 years of implementation, our responsibility doesn't end for these sites. So let's say as part of the post-construction monitoring, something does arise that wasn't predicted in the impact assessment, there is that responsibility there to do follow-up, whether it's remediation or follow-up work to ensure that we address any of those unforeseen impacts. That or unforeseen issues that the mitigation measures didn't fully address. But based on our experience with dredging and those mitigation measure techniques, they are well used and well proven throughout a lot of these projects across Ontario and Canada. I'll turn it over to my colleagues in case anybody else has an additional point to that.
Yeah, just to step back to your first question about Indigenous engagement, I guess just to add to with our ongoing engagement and consultation, there's been the invitation extended for archaeological monitors to attend studies that were going on, as well as some of the biological field work. So that's taken place over the last years and will be upcoming again. On the large-scale sediment sites in other lakes and regions in the Ontario, I can't think of a specific example where I've heard of poor outcomes post-dredging. We have colleagues that we work very closely with Environment Canada, who administer the areas of concern program. So I can certainly reach out and see if there's any specifics that would be worth mentioning, and I can pass along any information. What I have heard is more, I'm not thinking of a specific site, but where monitored natural attenuation didn't end up being the solution. So they waited to try to see if nature would indeed recover, and then years down the road, it was found that a more invasive solution was needed. But we can reach out to our colleagues at Environment Canada and provide you with any examples that we can think of.
Thank you. And another question that I have is, and this is a clarification about the report, the $10 million is for the city-owned lots. Is that correct? The stuff that's owned by the municipality, is that right? So what would be,
correct, yes.
what would be the total cost the federal government would be spending on this project? Just ballpark. I know it's early and you still have to go figure that out, but just give me an idea, like how much this would cost the federal government, excluding the $10 million potentially of the municipality. I'm just curious.
So the price tag that was identified in the S&P was around that $70 million mark. But like I said, it is that plus or minus 50%. So those numbers will really be refined over the next year.
Thank you.
Councillor Shaves.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank my colleagues for answering some of my questions. I would like to dive into one a little further in regards to other dredgings and other locations. To your knowledge, has there been any negative aspects to the dredging in any of the other waterways or harbors?
Do you mean from a significant adverse effect or just potential negative impacts in general?
Any negative aspects, minor or major?
Yeah, so some of the things that we'll be addressing or looking at in the next year as part of the impact assessment is potential impacts to turtle and turtle habitat. That's something that's been raised and something that we're planning to address in the detailed design and through mitigation measures. It could mean avoiding impacts or it could mean reducing them. Fish and fish habitat, was mentioned already today. Archaeology or impacts to shipwrecks is something that is being addressed or being assessed as part of the impact assessment. There is a small potential sorry, I'm thinking of the impact assessment. I was going to say impacts to terrestrial habitat, but that's really being already mitigated as part of this revised conceptual plan with that buffer to shoreline dredging. Dredging is really focused on those impacts to the water and the habitat that's there. So water quality, fish and fish habitat, aquatic, which includes aquatic vegetation, and some of those wildlife, particularly turtle impacts. They're also, like I mentioned, well understood. We're hoping that the baseline data, particularly around turtles, further refines some of those mitigation measures, but that's generally what it covers. A lot of those are outlined in those tables in that CCIC document, which is kind of that large scoping document for what the impact assessment is going to cover over the next year.
Okay, maybe I'll make myself a little more clear. Of the dredging that has already occurred, have there been any negative impacts from those results?
For those other projects?
Yes, prior projects which already been completed.
I haven't seen the impact assessments as from those other projects like Tara mentioned. From our own projects where dredging occurred, those impact assessments concluded that there'd be no significant adverse effects if those mitigation measures and environmental controls during construction are implemented. We've seen some lessons learned, which have refined some of those mitigation measures over the years, but we have not had any significant adverse effects as a result of those projects.
Okay, so and about how many previous projects have there been completed, if we could make a comparison?
I unfortunately don't have a number off the top of my head.
Approximately?
I've been at the waterways for the last 10 years, so there's been a number of dredge or in-water work projects involved, but we don't unfortunately have an approximate number.
Is it 10 or more?
It would be more than 10.
20 or more?
I'm not sure. Likely.
Okay, thank you. In one of your answers to Councillor Amos, you mentioned that the water quality was good in Kingston. So my question is, why are we doing this?
Sure. So the risk assessment does focus on, like Gary said, both the chemical risk, so how much contamination is present on the site, and that chemical risk can be divided into a couple of factors. Water quality is just one of those. The other piece is where contamination is tied to the sediments. So although water quality is good, the condition of those sediments themselves are not. The risk assessment process also looks at how those contaminants have moved into the environment as well. So what the levels of concentration look like, for example, in fish tissue, how they look at the lower food web. So that's things like benthics, so the little insects that hang out in the sediment. The results of that impact assessment shows that those are impaired. It then kind of goes up the food web to see how those contaminants have moved up the food chain as well, and then the impacts to those, and then as well as the potential risks to the environment and humans associated with those concentrations. So not just about water quality itself, but then also where the contaminants are, which in this case are mostly associated with that lake bed or those sediments on the bottom of the inner harbor. I know, Gary, that's my biological description of the risk assessment. I don't know, Gary, if you wanted to add anything to that. Oh, and you're on mute.
I thought I clicked it. Sorry about that. The risks of chemicals in the aquatic environment really fall into three main pathways. There's the aqueous pathway, which is what you've asked about, but there's also a sediment pathway and a tissue accumulation pathway. 2 out of the 3 are issues for environmental risks in the harbor. It's mostly the direct contact through sediment pathway. So even if the water is clean, the kinds of chemicals that we're dealing with, they really like sediment, they bind to it, and they use that sediment contact as a vehicle to affect food resources and in some cases direct effects to the animals. So it doesn't have to get into the water in order for there to be a problem. And that's particularly the case for what we call biomagnifying or highly bioaccumulative substances. Those are like mercury and PCBs would probably be the 2 best examples from this site. Those chemicals are not well evaluated through the water concentrations. It's much more important what gets methylated and distributed up the food chain. And we have observed tissue concentrations of mercury and PCBs in Kingston Harbor that is above safe levels, including above levels that would be protected through respecting the consumption advisories. So that's why even though the water's clean, we still have issues to address from an overall risk management perspective.
Thank you. You mentioned about the barrier curtain around the barge in order to prevent the sediments from getting out. And you made reference to the barrier that we had around the third crossing, the Wobbin crossing. I'm not sure you're aware, but we've had actually issues with that barrier with animals eating it. So I'm just wondering, are you going to be using the same barrier or are you going to be using something different, which would be more environmentally friendly and not leaking styrofoam throughout the river?
Yeah, so we were a regulator, are currently a regulator on that project. So I'm very familiar with the challenges that the third crossing has had with those turbidity curtains. They have done some adaptation to those curtains, including wire mesh around them to prevent some of, it was muskrats chewing on those curtains. The majority of those issues, so we will kind of take those adaptations into account as a proactive measure, but the majority of those issues in terms of muskrats chewing the turbidity curtains happened over the course of the winter, just given their construction schedule. A lot of, again, we're in the very conceptual stage and moving into detailed design, so we'll examine this further over the next year. But right now at the concept level, our in-water work windows are not over the winter season, mainly as a driver from turtle overwintering habitat. So that's one important factor. And then the third crossing turbidity curtains were also quite large, and they were all in during the course of construction. At a preliminary stage, things like turbidity curtains, because it's happening over multiple seasons for kind of this 3-year phasing, also wouldn't be in place potentially in a given water lot over the full course of those 3 years. So those kind of 3 factors would reduce that potential for animals chewing on the curtains and releasing the foam itself.
Okay, so you're saying that you're changing processes and we've learned from our mistakes, to confirm?
That is what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you. It was touched on wildlife mitigation. I think you did touch on this, just want to confirm that there's going to be a timing issue. First being nesting season for both turtles and waterfowl, then also a hatching season for both, especially since turtles may have 2 hatching seasons, which I've learned in the past year and a half. And then there's also hibernation of the turtles in the lake. Are there cameras or something under the barge so they would be able to detect wildlife in the area that they would plan to dredge in order to prevent encountering the wildlife?
So we haven't gone into that level of detail yet. Kind of the first mitigation measure that we look at is those timing windows, and those timing windows restrict when we can do in-water work, and are really focused on those most sensitive biological life cycles. So for turtles, especially in the water, they're most vulnerable and have the most potential impact during the winter when they are in usually one spot. They're conserving all their energy because they're under the ice and they're not eating. So we'll use timing windows. Things like turtle nestings can be more easily mitigated for. The Friends of Kingston Inner Harbor and Turtles Kingston have also graciously provided a lot of data of where some of those nesting areas are. They've done a lot of effort for turtle nest protection, so that will be incorporated into the impact assessment. And also ensuring that we have corridors in between these phasing. So it's not just about actually impacting the individual turtles, let's say, but also ensuring that they can get to those important areas for their life cycle, like nesting sites. So that'll be incorporated into the detailed design over the next year. Things like cameras are a great idea. We are, as part of the telemetry work and some of the work that happened in previous years, actually used underwater cameras to try and see what turtles were doing over the winter. So something that could be taken to account for a specific mitigation on the barge during the process.
Just to add to that too, I think it's important to note that we've added a shoreline dredging buffer zone in some of those areas, and that's the hope is to help reduce some of the potential impacts on turtle basking habitat. But as Valerie mentioned, more analysis, more data collection, documenting of those species presence, their critical habitats and nesting sites. All of these findings will be documented in the DIA that is being worked on right now.
Thank you. And just to clarify, I said cameras, but that's, and or you could probably use radar or whatever, like fish finders and things like that may also help. Next set of questions, more financial, and it may be more towards city staff. And I know it's been touched on that the number is probably more than 10 million in today's age and probably by 2027. However, we can't keep tapping into our reserves, as one day we won't have any left. So I was wondering if there'd be someone that might be able to address that.
City staff can't answer questions during briefing, so you'd have to wait till the business item to ask staff questions.
Fine. I deep protest. Maybe this financial question might be for the delegation. There could be a negative impact on this project on local businesses such as Metal Marine. Will there be some form of compensation for them or any other businesses for lost revenues or other?
Yeah, as part of our project planning process, businesses operating in the harbor will be contacted to ensure that we have a good understanding of their operational needs. So impacts to those operations that could be associated with the project can be identified early and hopefully managed, and that information to be incorporated into detailed design and the project implementation planning. We appreciate the feedback on the importance of metalcraft to the community, and it's definitely something we're working on.
Okay, that's good news concerning they're going to soon be impacted by the current situation with our causeway or your causeway. Thank you.
Councillor Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. And apologize, I'm not expert on this. Is my first time I'm hearing all of this detailed information, and I want to appreciate the delegates bring the information and all of you putting all of this together. My first question is, I'll be simple as I can. It was asked earlier, but I will just want to ask one of you to elaborate a little bit more. If city dropped out from this project, and you said you're not seeking permission from the city or approval from the city to discontinue this. This project will continue anyway. That is correct?
Right now, the sediment management plan takes a harbor-wide approach. So we are hoping that as a result of this meeting and hopefully council approval, that we can continue to work with the city as part of the detailed design process. So that we can continue to take that harbor-wide approach in order to reduce the overall chemical risk as a result of those contaminants that are in there. We're still relatively early in the process, so hopefully we can have those conversations over the next year in terms of defining what that city participation is like. We're still at that concept stage, so we don't really have those specific answers in terms of what the project might look like, depending on the feedback from the city.
Thank you. I will appreciate if the answer can be a little bit smaller and not lengthy because I will lose the concentration. So my next question is to Gary for his expertise. Can you please share with us why any level of government will initiate such project and they will spend time and resources? What is the biggest reason can be behind? And what is, if government don't take such initiate or launch such initiate, how it will impact the human life and habitat life?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Were you asking for what the main environmental driver is for the project as a whole, for overall protection of the environment?
Okay, let me ask you again. Why any level of a government initiate such project like this, clean up the harbor, take the contamination away? What is the reason behind?
I might jump in, Gary, if that's okay. The goal of the project is really meeting the federal government's commitments to managing our contaminated sites that are located on our water lots that we administer in a responsible manner. There's been decades of study that show natural recovery are not recovered enough to be safe for its current uses by people or by fish and wildlife. The studies that we've undertaken has concluded that people, fish, and wildlife may experience negative health effects or risks if exposed to the contaminated sediments in the harbor bed for the length of time. So the management measures that are being proposed and the dollar values that are to be spent are really to manage those risks to human and ecological receptors due to the federal government's commitment to managing its environmental liabilities in a responsible manner.
So during the public consultations, you guys mentioned in the presentation that you guys has to consult with the many stakeholders involved in this project. So I haven't read honestly that what was the results, what was the outcome, what was the majority of the stakeholder was telling you to go ahead, or they're not happy with it, or they're opposing, or just giving the signal to go ahead?
We did get a mix of responses throughout the engagement period. I think we received a lot of valuable feedback, and the feedback really has been incorporated into our changes in our management plan. Key points about turtles and ecological habitats and other key valued features from the community have really come through in the stakeholder engagement. And we're certainly taking those concerns in top of mind as we move into the detailed design period.
And also you mentioned that in coming years, you guys still are going to consult with the stakeholders. You're going to take input. So can I assume that the people or the stakeholders, such as Friend of Inner Harbor, Kingston, and the Save the Turtle groups, if they have any concerns, you will be consider and accommodate their concern to satisfy them that, that whatever their concern is, that will be taken care of it.
Yeah, so we've met a number of times. So we've come to EITP, we've done virtual sessions, but we have also had one-on-one meetings with some of those groups. We've had a couple with the Friends of Kingston and Inner Harbor. We've met with Turtles Kingston over the last 2.5 years and got a lot of their data as well. And we've already actually changed the design since the concept that we presented 2.5 years ago to incorporate some of those suggestions and concerns that we've heard. We haven't been able to address all of the concerns we've heard so far because we're still at that concept stage, but we are keeping track of all of the concerns that we've heard. And the goal would be to address them during the detailed design process or assess them in the impact assessment to ensure that we don't have any significant negative effects to the environment, which is the majority of the concerns we've heard during the impact assessment process. So yes, we will take them into consideration. We've already changed the plan based on some of those concerns we've heard, and I think we have a better plan as a result of that feedback process that we've engaged on.
Last question. In worst case scenario, again, if a city dropped out from this plan and this, okay, no, federal government can go ahead and clean their part or their lot of water lots, and we will. Is that possibility in the future the city has to probably come up with their own idea and they will end up to do it on their own?
I think we'd have to look at that at the end of the design process and see where we are. I think there's a lot of opportunities to align this project with the city's plans for shoreline mitigation and its waterfront plan. So I think we'll have to park the question until the end of the design period where we can have a better sense of how we're going to be moving forward.
I think we've also heard a lot of questions tonight about the price tag. We're hoping that if we get the continued support for staff to be involved as part of this process over the next 10 years, that there are a lot of potential in-kind contributions that the city can make. So it's not necessarily about a $10 million cash contribution. It could mean in-kind support in terms of staging area, disposal fees. There's kind of a potential of what those contributions can be, but some of that information we'd have to get directly from city staff so that we can hopefully develop of what that partnership agreement might look like if the city water lots are involved in the project.
Well, thank you very much. But my concern is, I know my colleagues asked the cost, but I don't want to ask you the cost. I'm just trying to make sure if it's a good time for us now to participate in this program and go ahead and clean it up, the R lot. If we don't do that now, and if our lot is also part of the contamination area or have some kind of contamination, some level of contamination there, not now, but in the future, we will end up to ask to clean that or clean up. That cost may be 3 times more than that instead now. So my question again is that our lots need to be cleaned either now or in the future?
Yeah, so the Woolen Mills water lot, which is that city water lot in the middle of the management plan, does have contamination exceedances. I'm not familiar with kind of the provincial or municipal liabilities, but there is contamination and contamination risk in the water lot. And there is benefit for participating all at once. One, we wouldn't have to look at ways to isolate the city's properties to make sure that they don't recontaminate the areas that are cleaned up. That costs a lot of extra money and time. There's a lot of cost savings in terms of the whole Inner Harbor and all these water lots going together from a staging perspective, from kind of one contractor or one contract addressing all of these sites at one period of time. There are those kind of cost savings and benefits when it comes to doing this all at once. And those exceedances are present on the city's water lots, so that risk will still be present and either have to be isolated or addressed at some future period. I don't know, Gary, from a risk assessment perspective, if you wanted to add anything to that?
Yeah, and it's obviously a complicated issue given the number of owners here. Transport and Parks Canada have agreed to collaborate, and that covers a lot of the contaminated sediment area. But the private property water lots and the City of Kingston lands do make a meaningful contribution to the overall pattern of contamination. And most specifically, some of those strips of city administered land are right along the shorelines, which I think we've all agreed on this meeting are quite important for habitat, character of the harbor, potential linkages to the city master plan and the like. So if we were to cleave off the city parcels from the federal plan, yes, we could implement a plan, but it would be less efficient. There would be some awkward things to resolve around the edges of water lot boundaries. It's not as simple as just stop dredging at the edge of a line and pick it up 3 years later. Sediments are dynamic, and these boundaries are fairly artificial in terms of where the organisms feed and live. So it's definitely the most efficient and environmentally responsible to deal with this contamination issue at an integrated whole harbor level. As you incrementally chip off pieces and push them to the side to deal with later, it starts to gradually undermine the overall project effectiveness. I can't quantify it right now because we'd have to describe exactly which section, how long do you wait. You'd have to model how the contaminants that were left unremediated would slowly shift and move into adjacent water lots. So it's clearly a complicated issue, but the thing I can say with confidence is that the best solution gets all of the landowners and stakeholders together and works towards a coordinated solution, especially for shoreline areas where the details of slopes, habitat adjustments, opportunities for restoration, those things are, I think, pivotal to the success of the shoreline design and very difficult to disentangle if you start dropping water lots out.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's a great presentation, good information, and I appreciate for all of you to be here tonight.
Okay, so I just have one quick question. It may be too early to answer this, I'm not sure. But once, say, you remediate shorelines like this and you remove all the sediments, where does it go? Does it just go and ship somewhere, get shipped somewhere in a pile and it just stays there? Or does it go through a refinement process where you separate out the different heavy metals and toxins and then clean or sanitize the contaminants in some way?
So it is a little too early for that question. Those kind of details would come over the next year. We have certainly heard over the last 2.5 years, and especially in the last couple months with re-engagement on this revised plan, that those details are something that stakeholders and the public want. So they are coming. Those contaminants or sediments, when they're taken out of the Inner Harbor itself, will be full of water. The project will kind of aim to remove as much of that water as we can where it meets those water quality conditions and put it back in the Inner Harbor. And then those sediments would go to a registered registered landfill. It would have to kind of meet the requirements of that landfill, whether it's a hazardous waste disposal or a general landfill. But we don't yet have details in terms of where exactly that waste would go.
Okay, thank you. Anybody have questions that are not on the committee? Councillor Osanik?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I have a question about the turbidity curtains, since you've mentioned it. And I just wondered if you're aware of the styrofoam problem that the city had during the construction of the Waubin Third Crossing.
Yeah, so Parks Canada was a regulator on that project. We are very aware of the styrofoam issue, which was mainly caused by muskrats chewing the curtains in the winter. We're going to take those lessons learned from the Waubin crossing, and then some of our timing, which won't be over winter for most of the water lots, will also kind of avoid that muskrat chewing issue just by this season that we'll be doing the work in.
Okay, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Maybe talk to Dan Franco in engineering, because we had to start to use rigid plastic pipes, suspended floats. We had to put a metal casing around the rigid plastic pipes. So, muskrats are still around in the other seasons other than winter, and we cannot afford to ruin the environment with more styrofoam down the river and St. Lawrence River and Atlantic Ocean, like what happened during the Waubin crossing. My other question is about the detailed impact assessment. When that gets finished this fall, how will we find out about it? Will it come back to this committee?
I guess I would leave that for a recommendation by this committee and city staff. The fall timeline is when the draft will be available. The final DIA is sometime later that winter. So that fall draft would go out for stakeholder and public consultation. So hopefully the city staff will be involved in the detailed design process. So whether that gets shared internally through your municipal processes, or we'd be happy to come back to this committee as well at that time.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. There were many questions that were submitted by the public and councillors at that marathon meeting we had 2.5 years ago in 2021, and have continued up till tonight's meeting. So at what stage will answers be given to those questions? Will there be a list at some point of these were the questions and these are the answers? Because right now, reading all the questions, I don't know where, what page in what document the answers might be. I think all the questions are still outstanding, but maybe they're somewhere, I don't know.
So some of those, in terms of from the last DITP meeting in September 2021 till winter 2022, are in that What We Heard report on the website. We're updating the FAQ for some of those specific questions. Some of them have been addressed because we've adapted our design as well. But if that's something that EITP is requesting in terms of a direct question and response, and what documents you can find that information are, we can certainly provide that if that's being requested.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I think that would be really helpful. So has Meadowcraft Marine, has it been one of your stakeholders that you've spoken to about what effect it will have on their business?
I'll pass that one to Transport Canada.
Yes. Yes, we've been working through our real property group at arranging a meeting, and we have plans to do so in the very near future with Bob Clark.
Okay, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I have a question about the shoreline of Doug Fleur Park and around the woolen mill. So when you say nature-based solutions are being added, is that the same thing as naturalization? Like back in 2021, the big problem was you were going to use riprap and like revetment, like the big rocks and Gambian cages, and that was just going to be devastating to the hatchlings of turtles. So can I have confidence we're not doing that? Like, I still think I've seen like the mention of pebbles, and I'm not sure if you've been following in the Toronto Star, the Humber Bay Beach, just got switched over to what they call pebbles, but really they're pretty big rocks, and everyone's up in arms over what just happened to Humber Bay Beach. So these nature-based solutions, like I also saw tonight, you use the word green engineering. Like, are we talking about keeping the shoreline natural like it is right now with lots of bushes along the shoreline? Or are we talking rocks?
So apologies, I think we've used, like you said, three terms at least to describe that. So they are all the same thing. We have incorporated that into the design. It's two parts. So one, the design has that shoreline dredge buffer, particularly where there's no shoreline intervention proposed along some of those northern water lots where there are existing habitat and basking logs. We'll still and have been inventorying some of those habitat features to make sure we know what's there, and we'll monitor that during and post construction. A lot of the shorelines where that nature-based solutions are proposed in kind of the southern part of that western shore actually already have a lot of rock. Some have armor stone as part of them. So the nature-based solutions kind of takes that into account, and it tries to naturalize those areas. It's proposing planting. Some of those plantings are at this conceptual stage prickly, so it kind of deters people from accessing some of those contaminated slopes, and then proposes actually enhancing it with things like basking logs, with root balls, so you flip the tree around and that then becomes fish habitat. So there's definitely opportunities not only to naturalize what's there, but also enhance some of the habitat while still meeting the goal of isolating those sediments that are in kind of that southern section of the western shore to protect kind of exposures from people and the environment of the contaminants that are there.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I just have two more questions. Councillor Amos was talking about monitoring of our drinking water, and I still have that concern. Are you now taking into account our water flow patterns? Like we heard in our delegation tonight, that water actually flows west from the river into Lake Ontario, and that gets close to our water intake. And so I think you mentioned that you're going to have some controls in there. I need to have confidence. I'm not going to be drinking chromium and those other chemicals you mentioned that are in Inner Harbor.
So yes, we're taking it into account as part of the detailed design. Preliminary stuff says it won't reach the drinking water intake, but we'll refine that with data and modeling during this next year. And then also put controls in place during construction so that even if the impact assessment is saying it won't reach the drinking water intake, we'll actively be monitoring it in the field to make sure that that's what's happening during the project.
Okay, thank you. Just to continue on from that, it's not just our drinking water intake for the city, but the poor Wolf Island residents who live right at the base of, Confederation Basin. They take their water from Lake Ontario and then Gananoque further along. So it's not just our King Street West. My final
30
question.
seconds.
Yes, thank you. My final question is, if you're familiar with the Cornwall sediment strategy, because they also have mercury, and they decided natural recovery, and that was through an environmental impact assessment that was done with the feds and with the province, and they decided to do nothing. So could that also be an outcome of this detailed impact assessment you're going to have finished by the fall? Natural recovery.
So we do actually have monitored natural recovery as a large part of the project already. So through that risk assessment process, well, actually to go back, the whole eastern half of the inner harbor, those levels were kind of under thresholds to do anything. So no action is being taken, even monitoring on the eastern side of the inner harbor. Through kind of that whole middle part, almost 3/4 of the inner harbor is that monitored natural recovery, because the levels, although there's some risk there, the levels weren't as high as needing intervention. So this plan, where intervention is being proposed, which is just a small piece of this plan, is really focused on those hot spots where that risk is too high and doesn't kind of meet the thresholds for monitored natural recovery. And that might be dredging, it could be capping, or it could be locking up those contaminants in things like activated carbon.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, the same tools for assessment and the framework that would have been used for the Cornwall site was also used for Kingston Inner Harbor. The outcomes of the recommendation are different because there are some differences between the sites, the other contaminants at play, the water movement and the sediment movement within the Inner Harbor, in contrast to the Cornwall site.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Ridge.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. So I'm very grateful to my fellow councillors for asking many, many questions. Narrowing my list down to essentially one. Much to the relief of the delegation, I'm sure. So my question is about Anglin Bay. So I know that there's been questions asked about consultations with businesses, which was what I was going to ask. And so maybe there are two questions here. The first one is, based on where you are in the design and potentially planning phase of this project, do you have an idea of how long the implementation would take for what sounds like substantial remediation of Anglin Bay?
So I don't believe we have those details yet as part of detailed design. Part of that kind of next steps of engaging some of those businesses in Anglin Bay is understanding their kind of operating times, constraints, those kind of things, which will then feed into that detailed and kind of staging time of year process over the next year and a half.
Yeah, we're hopeful that the conversations that we'll have in the coming months will help inform that schedule for design on how we can best implement the remediation within Anglin Bay.
Oh, okay. Thank you. And so then just as a follow-up question to that, based on the level that's estimated for remediation in Anglin Bay, have there been, can anyone think of any comparators from previous projects in terms of that substantial level of remediation, and just basically an estimate of how long it took for implementation in those in that respective comparator?
In our conceptual plans, no, we do believe that the work could be undertaken within sort of one of the dredging seasons that we've mentioned, phasing that dredging over 3 years. So we do think it would be around one season, but the specific phasing of that will be yet to be worked out in the detailed design.
Okay, thank you very much again for everything. This is obviously very preliminary, but I think there's been a lot of really good questions that have been asked and well answered. So I think that's everything for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to ask this on behalf of both my own personal curiosity and those of my constituents, which is that area there, so Inner Harbor. So thank you again.
Councillor Oosterhoff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I acknowledge too the great questions from my colleagues, and thank you for the presentations as well. I'm very, very impressed with everyone's ability to answer very well, and I'm very pleased with what I'm hearing. And so I was also concerned very much about the intakes of the water. So I was surprised to hear that so it must be from a scientific view, is that water flow that you learn when the third crossing was done, is that water flow in our favor? It's fairly light, I think, or not light, but it's not a fast flowing river. Is that a positive thing? And again, the spread of the contaminant is a paramount on everyone's minds. And so I'm glad that my colleagues mentioned Wolf Island, of course, all the way down the river, like to the communities that could be impacted in singular homes. And I know that's going to be part of your study, but do we know how far sediment could flow in this situation, the toxins?
So we did do a sediment transport in 2017. It's one of the documents that I shared on the website and that some of the stakeholder groups have reviewed. Like you said, it is a pretty low hydrological environment. So the main flow is through that eastern side where the navigation channel is. And then the Inner Harbor itself kind of circulates along that western shore and is mainly driven by kind of wind activity. There's a little bit of flow in high spring melt conditions that might push it around on that western shore, but it's not in the direct path of that main flow channel coming from Kingston Mills and then going through the LaSalle Causeway. That LaSalle Causeway almost acts like a little bit of a basin on that lower end as well, because it's that choke point for the water to flow through the bridge. So that is kind of a benefit for additional, I won't say natural engineered containment with the existence of that causeway on the lower end of the Inner Harbor. That's just very kind of high level takeaway from what we've done to date, but as part of detailed design, we'll do additional geotechnical investigations, modeling to confirm some of those preliminary conclusions from the sediment transport. We've also been working with the Waban city staff that have been in charge of the Third Crossing project. So some of that modeling that was done for the bridge itself actually extended all the way to the causeway. So we are kind of collaborating with some of that other information that's been collected in that area as well.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate that very, very much, and excellent answers to the concerns of our community. Thank you very much again, and look forward to hearing more, and well done.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so that concludes the briefing. So now we'll move on to business. But did anybody want to take a 5-minute break since it's been 2.5 hours? Okay, so we're just going to take a quick 5-minute break and then we will be right back. All right, everyone, it's 8:28. It's been 5 minutes. That's the, no. All right. You gotta sit down first. All right, so now we're moving on to business. And item A, which is update to Kingston Inner Harbor contaminated sediment management plans. So the brief, it was already introduced via the briefing, so now we're gonna go with additional comments from the committee, but it has to be related to the report, not the briefing. So, Councillor Tozo.
Thank you. I'd like to call the question.
Do you have a seconder? Councillor Hassan?
When will the public get to ask questions? Is this after the vote, before the vote?
So if, through you, Mr. Chair, if a calling of the question passes, which requires a 2/3 vote, the vote is done and the meeting moves on. So calling the question would make the public not be able to speak to the item. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Just call the vote.
All right, I'll call the vote. All in favor? Opposed? All right, that fails. All right, so are there any additional questions from the committee? Councillor Shaves.
Thank you. So one question I was getting to, which is financial. I do understand that the approximate number which was given was 10 million, but that's back in 2021. Certainly it's gone up, as been mentioned. But my question is in regards to our own financial contribution, and we can't keep tapping into our reserves as one day there won't be any left. And as far as I know, this wasn't in the budget. So I was wondering if someone could address that.
Who's going to take that?
Thank you. Through you, Mr.
McClatchy?
Chair, I can handle that, I suppose. I'm not the CFO, but I can say that for this particular project, there's no capital money that's been identified within capital budget plans for it. So any new money would truly be new money. It would have to be earmarked based on what we would know from a discussion with the federal government on this. The $10 million was preliminary in 2021. It's going to be a while before we have confidence in what the actual number is. I will say that there's opportunity, as was mentioned during the presentation, there's opportunities for how the city contribution could, what form that could take. There's a lot of in-kind opportunities as opposed to direct cost. There might also be opportunities for other sources of funding. I do note that in other sediment remediation programs across the Great Lakes, the province has participated financially. That's not something we've looked into directly yet, but it's certainly an opportunity. I think that's all I can say to your question.
Thank you. Now I know that potentially the date to start this project is 2027, so many of us may or may not be here that time. Yes, I'm looking at you. But considering, and we could have a number of different governments by that time, so I'm just wondering, I'm not sure if anyone can address this, maybe I'll just ask it as a question. Considering the timeline, I guess to be a change in possibly of a new government, a government which doesn't actually believe in the environment, so this actually may not take off if they decide to remove the funding. I'm just wondering, anyone be able to address that, if that would be a possibility, or is this locked in?
So we can speak to what was proposed in the most recent 2024 federal budget. The budget hasn't been tabled yet in Parliament, but that budget did speak to renewing the federal contaminated site program in kind of the next phase, so a next 5-year block in terms of renewing that program. It did speak to an overall budget, but there has been no indication in terms of splitting that budget across the next 5 years to specific projects. So at this point, all we know is that the program has been renewed for another phase.
Okay, I'll be a little more specific, apparently. So in 2025, we'll have another election, federal election, which, the way it's looking right now, won't be the current one. So they may overturn the funding or even the whole budget. So there's a possibility that maybe this won't happen if we get a government that's not environmental friendly or want to clean up the environment.
I don't think any of us here can answer that question. That's sort of beyond our capacity as civil servants, and it's going to depend on what a future government decides, and we can't know that.
Okay, that's what I sort of thought, but I want to put it out there. Thank you.
Any other questions from committee members? Councillor Stephen? Yeah, that should be at the next, yeah. Any other questions from committee members? Any questions from other councillors that are here? Okay, seeing as none, so we'll move on to the public portion of the meeting. So you would have 5 minutes to speak, and you can just come to one of the microphones here and just state your name for the record.
Sago, I'm a Mohawk and I'm a water walker. And what I'm asking is, who's going to be the person if something does happen when you're dredging? Because I know of 2 different places where they've dredged and the toxins have went through and some of the people got sick. So what I'm asking is, can you guarantee us here in Kingston that that ain't going to happen here to our people or to our animals? Because I do water walks all the way to Ottawa every year for the water. And that's the most important thing to our people is clean water. So are you going to be the one to turn around and guarantee us?
You got to ask all your questions, and then they'll answer after everybody's asked questions.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Anyone else wish to? Just state your name and you have 5 minutes.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you so much for your service. Really appreciate it. And thank you very much for your concern for our company, Metalcraft. Really makes me feel good. Listening tonight, I made lots of notes, both sides. And one I really heard was, we've had all these consultations, all this feedback, and completely ignored by you people. I'm shocked. They are ignoring the public will. I think Kingston needs to stand up and say, enough is enough. Stop this. So what we know is, we've had a disaster with a public works government project at the bridge. A terrible disaster for the city. We've had a disaster with the ferry program. A ferry that's out of warranty, it's not even in service and they can't get it going in service. And now we're gonna have another disaster where they kill our water supply. They can't prove that. They can't guarantee it. So I go like you did. I went and looked up things. So I went to an environmental magazine. Environmental impacts of dredging, it says. Lastly, dredging in contaminated areas resuspends pollutants like industrial chemicals, heavy metals, and toxins, making them bioavailable to surrounding organisms and entering wider food chains, our water supply. I looked up the Fox River. That was a disaster. Lawsuit upon lawsuit, but the worst thing of all, they had an entire year of spillage of PCBs into the water. That turned out to be good for Metalcraft Marine. We built a boat for them. They are going to be monitoring PCBs in their water for 25 years. That's how long. That's unbelievable. The cost of monitoring that water, but the worst, we have no drinking supply. We're going to be like that Flint, Michigan, bottled water and pipelines. It's ridiculous. So Transport Canada does not do anything about people anchoring in that harbor. We have been complaining since 2018. The Canada Marine Act says they can't anchor there. And it specifically says they can't anchor in a place where they could disturb sediment. And Transport Canada has done nothing in 7 years to stop the anchoring. We've called every police agency known to man, and they said unless Transport Canada authorizes them, they can't do anything. So these are the people who are going to pollute our water supply. There's no guarantee. They can't guarantee it because can't be done. Every time you look up any dredger, whether it's suction dredge, cutter dredge, or what you saw out here with the ferry, the water was brown when they were dredging out there. Kehoe, just brown. They cannot control the PCBs or the chromium or any of that other stuff. So the suction dredge, which is called, environmental dredging, no such thing. That's greenwashing, by the way. When you suck it out, they keep the sediment, but the water goes back in the water with all the chemicals in it. It's in the water. They got some of it in the sediment, but how much did they get? They don't even know. A dredger can't tell you how much I'm really going to get because they don't know. It's not a very scientific art, believe me. You just look at the equipment, it's just smash, grab, and that's it. I'm asking the city of Kingston, stop this before we have another disaster on our hands. And I know you guys care, and thank you again so much for all your time. Bob Clark, Metalcraft. And by the way, Transport Canada is meeting with us tomorrow.
Okay, anyone else? Remember to state your name, and you have 5 minutes.
Got it. Dan Webster, resident of Kingston. I live on the waterfront, in fact, right on Angelim Bay, and I am very concerned about this large project. It's so close to our population of citizens. I'm concerned with the dredging, and I wanted to mention it, and I think a lot of it was said already, but I want to mention that there were other sites like Cornwall that didn't go with this dredging, and also Belleville was another one that didn't go either. So there's probably other sites as well that didn't. Now, I'll get to why I'm here. I'm going to read this letter. This letter is from the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. This letter is in support of Friends of the Harbour, Kingston, Ontario, and from the National Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Elmer St. Pierre, in regard to the plans of dredging and remediating a large area along the river and harbour in the city of Kingston. The plans were brought to my attention by Dan Webster and Mary Farrar from the local group Friends of the Harbour, and I help Mary out sometimes in the Friends of the Harbour, who were concerned with the well-being of the wildlife along the shoreline should the project go ahead. We believe that all our water and shoreline rights should be protected. This project should not go ahead as it would affect not only our wildlife along the shoreline, such as turtles, frogs, snakes, ducks, fish, and birds, it also brings the possibility of an environmental disaster causing the water in the river and Lake Ontario to be unsuitable for drinking and swimming for years to come. Dredging up the natural sedimented toxins that Mother Earth has packed down into the bottom of the river where they are currently not affecting the waters should be left alone. Signed, National Chief Elmer St. Pierre who resides in Ottawa, but they have an office here that handles this area. Now, I just want to mention one last thing. A statement that's taken from the recognition statement posted on the City of Kingston website and read before every city council meeting, and I'm sure you're very aware of it, and I would like to repeat the words: we honor and celebrate these traditional lands as a gathering place of the original peoples and their ancestors who were entrusted to care for Mother Earth since time immemorial. We acknowledge and offer our gratitude for contributions to this community, having respect for all that we share this space and walk side by side into the future. Kingston City Councilors, how will you respond to the Indigenous people's voice that do not want the dredging plan to proceed? That's it. Thank you.
I'm just going to quickly pause. The Zoom on, something has happened with the Zoom connection with the chamber, so I'm not quite certain if members of the federal government heard that one portion. So through you, Mr. Chair, if we just take like 5 minutes so that can get solved, so they can be part of the conversation too, please. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so it seems everything has managed to turn itself back on. Good old turn off, turn on seems to have taught the computer its lesson. So we are fully back and ready to go. I will now call on the next member of the public who wishes to speak to kindly make their way to the speaker's area. Thank you.
Please state your name, and you have 5 minutes.
Hi. My name is Chris Hargreaves, 4060 Bath Road, Kingston. I'm speaking as Chair of the Conservation Committee for the Kingston Field Naturalists. We have 600 members in the Kingston, mainly in the Kingston region, and there is a lot of concern about this project. And what I think was apparent tonight is that to call it the sediment management plan for the Kingston Inner Harbour is really understating the issue. This should be a City of Kingston sediment management plan. There are concerns that pollution from the remedial work could go downriver. It could affect the water supply for the whole of Kingston. It could affect Wolf Island. It could go down the river. This is not just an isolated project looking at the Inner Harbour. There was also a question that was raised about if you take material out for dredging, where is it going to go to? The answer is, well, they haven't studied that yet. Well, I suggest it's about time they do. Councillor Asanic mentioned there was a very long, well-attended meeting of the EITP 2.5 years ago. These are questions that were raised then. To say, well, we haven't thought about it yet, is not appropriate. They had produced a long, in September, conceptual management plan. I only ran off the first page because it is 228 pages long. There was one reference to how to get rid of waste, contaminated sediments in that report. It's on page 189. It says, up to 3.5 hectares of contaminated sediments will be dredged up to a depth of 1 meter below the harbour bed. What does that mean? Not only do I not know what it means, not only do you probably know what it means, they don't know what it means. They were asked when we had a meeting with the Kingston Field Naturalists what that meant in terms of dump trucks, which will be traveling through Kingston. Where are they going? There was a reference that maybe the city could help with disposal fees. Oh, is it going to be disposed of somewhere within the city? Whose backyard is it going to? If it is going somewhere else, whose roads is it passing by? This is a project that concerns the whole of Kingston. There are a lot of people who say it is not necessary. You have a letter attached to the agenda for tonight from Peter Hodson, which raises a huge, I think it's 8 pages of questions, concerns about the project. Again, these have been out for about 2 years. None of them were answered tonight. There is this conceptual management study going on, but it does not address concerns. These are concerns of retired professors at Queen's. You can't just say, oh, well, we're the experts. We know best. They are the experts. They are saying this is dangerous. It is time that Sparks Canada listened. There was a reference to Councillor Hughes that you are being asked to participate in the design process. That is good once you continue the dialogue, but I sure hope you can start getting answers soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other members of the public who wish to speak? Just make sure you state your name and you have 5 minutes.
My name is Marinus Sorensen. I have 2 points. It was mentioned that the contaminant levels in the Inner Harbor haven't changed significantly over the last decade or decade and a half. And the implication was that continued natural remediation would not continue to lower the levels. But the legacy pollution is actually bordering on 100 years or even quite a bit more than that. So I would suggest that perhaps the implication is that natural remediation has already done an extremely good job and is now at the slower end of its job. Conversely, disturbing the sediments in a precisely opposite way to natural remediation is, as almost everybody has pointed out, suspend the pollutants back into the water column, and I want to continue with that. The other thing I would like to point out is that it was mentioned that monitoring would continue after the work was completed, but that actually monitoring of the sediments has been done, but not very much in the way of monitoring of storm flows and leachate coming from the land in general. So I take that to mean that a base level has not actually been established. That seems to be fairly critical to me. A base level for the sediments, sure, to some degree, but not for the water column. And clearly the water flows are varying constantly through the year. They vary constantly, they vary tremendously from hour to hour during an actual storm. Seems to me that continuous monitoring would be required to establish the kind of levels of pollution that enter every time it rains. This seems to me absolutely critical. If you need to know what your success rate is, then you need to know what the base rate was. I would also point out that there were, and to some degree still are, 7 streams that enter the Inner Harbor just on the west side alone. 2 of them used to enter Anglin Bay, and being in a karst environment, there are underground flows, presumably still do. Another one just north of Anglin Bay, and 3 into the bay at the tannery site, and 1 from the dump hill. All of these, again, presumably contributing underground flows. So between underground flows and surface flows and stream flows and stormwater flows, it seems to me these are all sources of ongoing contaminants that need to be taken into account. I don't hear that they have been. It's one of those questions that needs to be answered first. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else?
Randy Cadu, BICC. Laura Cameron had done a study on most of the landfill sites in and around the area. And from her study, she has learned that most of these sites will be at their capacity by 2027. So the question goes again is when they do the dredging, where's this stuff going to go? And how many dump sites are going to take contaminated material? Basically, that's the end of my question. Thank you.
All right, so I believe that's everyone in the chamber that has had an opportunity to speak. So I will turn to the speakers list on Zoom. There are 3 members joining us virtually on Zoom. If you could raise your virtual hand if you would like to speak. It's located at the very bottom of your screen. It looks like a little hand. Perfect. I will recognize Carrie Hill. You have 5 minutes.
I had a set of slides. I don't know whether they're available.
The meeting host is just putting them up in a moment. We'll start your timer as soon as they're up.
Okay. And I do want to say as a preface that I learned from Gary's comments tonight that a number of core samples have been taken since 2021. I'm not aware of any of the results of that data. But anyway, my presentation is really about the basis of the SMP in terms of the way the samples were obtained. So we're just waiting for the slides, I guess.
My apologies. It seems that the host's computer has decided, just like the other one, to throw a little bit of a fit. So it might be a little bit of a time, or if you would like to proceed with your 5 minutes, it's up to you, ma'am.
No, I think I need the slides, just so that people understand how the samples were taken. If someone else wants to go before me while you get the slides organized.
Okay, so I will quickly look to see if there are any members of the public other than, oh, there we go, never mind, perfect.
Okay, all right, 5 minutes starts. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak on this topic. To put this in context, slide 1 shows the conceptual design profile for the waterfront, or the water lot adjacent to the former tannery and smelter in the northwest corner of the KIH. And this was taken from the most recent project update in 2023. The river is shallow, as you can see, reaching about half a meter deep, 120 meters out from the shore. The plan is to remove, by dredging, sediment 1 meter thickness, which has been mentioned. The management plan is based on the analysis of contaminants in bulk samples of sediment at different points across the KIH. Slide 2. Anyone looking at the color-coded images of the contaminant levels, which we've seen in the report and other reports, will see that they represent bulk sediment chemistry. The majority of the studies used a sampling method that lowers a clamshell-like device down into the riverbed. This is called a Ponar device, but there are others like it. This grabs a scoopful of sediment and delivers it back to the surface boat. If you go to skip the next slide and go to the one after that. Okay. Let's see. This slide shows gosh, where am I? Shows the grabber being lowered through the water towards the sample site. And the next slide, once the sample site is reached up on the riverbed, the operator at the service activates it to open, scoop up the sediment, close, and return it to the boat. The next slide, please. Here are images of chromium on the left panel and mercury on the right panel present in the KIH. Again, these are the images we've all seen. Note that these are bulk samples representing the average accumulation over the past 20 or so years. Core sampling is more difficult and expensive to do, but gives us much more information on the location and stability of contaminants in the sediment. One study was conducted by Ken Reimer's group at RMC, published in 2010. They sampled chromium and water samples taken at different depths of the riverbed, adjacent to the former tannery property. Next slide. All of the pore samples taken from the full length of cores, or peepers, contain much less chromium than the level defined by the Canadian Water Quality Guideline for the Protection of Aquatic Life in Fresh Water. The closer to the top of the core, the lower the chromium concentration in the pore water. It is important to note that this study was conducted about 15 years ago. Additional sediment will have accumulated, which would be predicted to contain even lower chromium levels. We know that the water is pretty much clean. However, they also measured chromium in the sediment, and they found the highest chromium concentration in the sediment 15 years ago was 30 centimeters below the surface of the riverbed. Next slide. The KIH project, SNC-Lavalin, has analyzed core samples to determine how the sediment depth correlates with sediment age. The image shows the western shore of the harbor from the south, left-hand side, to the north. And the left-hand side is Anglin Bay, the Woolen Mill, former tannery, and Belle Island landfill sites. Cores were taken at the red circles in 2019. There's 6 of them. Let's focus on core 4A off the Orchard Street Marsh. This slide 9. This is the result of their data. This shows a linear relationship between sediment depth and when it was deposited. At 30 centimeters, i.e. when the RMC group found the highest concentration of chromium, the sediment was deposited about 50 years ago, around when the tannery closed. Further, you can see that the grabber sampling technique would be averaging the contaminant concentration accumulated over more than 20 years. That's shown on the upper left-hand side. Since the sediment was sampled 5 years ago, for the SNC-Lavalin, we don't know what state of contamination exists at the surface of the riverbed right now. We can therefore not make any conclusions about the risk of the sediment to the health of beings, humans and otherwise, using the harbor right now. To conclude, last slide. To conclude, we must know how the sediment contaminant load has changed since major industrial sources of contaminants have stopped, and what contamination
30 seconds.
Still occurring. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now look to see if the other 2 members wish to speak. I'm not seeing any movement, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so now can I get staff or the guests to respond to the questions or comments?
Sure, by staff you mean the project team?
Yep.
Okay, just making sure I understand the process. I really appreciate everybody's comments tonight. I think we have certainly heard some of them in some of our February and March one-on-one re-engagement sessions with the Friends and Kingston Field Naturalists. So appreciate hearing them today as well. I guess it's hard to kind of go through point by point of all the comments that we did here, but just I think a couple of key themes that I think we picked up. So I understand it's been 2.5 years. That is quite a long period of time between the last time we were here at EITP and today. And we don't have all of the answers to some of the questions that have been posed. We have certainly been recording them through these sessions, through the one-on-one sessions, and through kind of the open forum processes that we've had on the website. So they're not being lost as part of this process. We can't unfortunately answer them all because we are at that concept stage and we're still kind of gathering that information and working through it. I guess the good news is that we do hope to kind of move towards some of those answers over the next year, so hopefully by March 2025, to be able to fill in some of those questions as we move through detailed design and the impact assessment. I appreciate the concerns we've heard in terms of the potential interaction with the sediment movement and the water quality itself. The point of this project is really to reduce the overall risks and effects we're seeing from the existing contaminants in the Inner Harbor. Although some of them are buried at depth, they're not all buried at depth, and they are still moving around the Inner Harbor itself, like, for example, the PAHs in Anglin Bay that Gary spoke to during our presentation. We do have some of that core data. We are working on analyzing that data and finalizing those reports. So like we've done over the last 2.5 years, we'll certainly share that information when those reports are finalized, which should be pretty soon. In terms of the letter from the Congress of Aboriginal Council, we did receive that letter in February when we met with the Friends of Kingston Inner Harbor, and we certainly appreciate them sharing that letter with us. Maybe just a point of clarification in terms of Indigenous consultation and the duty to consult. So the Aboriginal Council of Chiefs is a community organization. We certainly do take their concern in that letter seriously, and we'll be considering it in the impact assessment and design process. But that Indigenous engagement and consultation happens on the nation-to-nation process with the rights holders. So that's often those individual communities, as opposed to some of the larger organizations that don't necessarily represent those rights holders in those communities. So while that letter is extremely important, it is separate from the Indigenous consultation process that we're undertaking with those rights holders. In terms of just looking at my notes here, I tried to take some good ones while people were talking. In terms of levels of chromium and some of the sampling, I think I'll defer that to Gary in a second. I guess to reiterate, we are still very much in that concept stage. We are focusing the plan in terms of those areas of higher risk and higher contamination for effects that are being seen as a result of those contaminants, and trying to minimize those and balance them with the potential incidental impacts to the environment when that work is conducted. We have multiple techniques in order to refine that over the next year to address some of the concerns like we've heard about turtles and fish. I'm not sure, Gary, if you want to speak to some of the questions that were raised by Carrie and others throughout, or if I touched on most of those pieces in my summary.
There's probably not time to dig into all of them. I'll maybe bundle a couple of the topics together, though. The concern that's been expressed is that the act of dredging will disturb the sediment bed and cause resuspension in a way that's fundamentally different than how it is under the current condition, and to a scale that would affect large areas for a long period of time. I don't agree with those suggestions, but those are what my impression of the raised issues are. There's a couple of things that have to be acknowledged in terms of the environmental distribution of the contaminants. One is that even though the contaminants are laid down over time in horizons, they don't stay in nice undisturbed sheets. Mechanical disturbance of sediments happens, biological disturbance happens, microorganisms mix them. Typically, most of that activity happens in the top 10 centimeters and then tapers off after that, but that process is ongoing. So another point is that the distribution of contaminants has not led to fundamental differences in the speciation of the chemicals with depth. I agree that hexavalent chromium is not dominant in the surface sediments, but it's also factually demonstrated that hexavalent chromium is not a large proportion of the contamination at depth. So, of course, we need to do our due diligence to make sure that the act of dredging over the scale of weeks to months of work doesn't change the condition of these contaminants and release them in a way that's unacceptable. But that's exactly why we do the kinds of tests that we do before the project, and it's also why we do validation monitoring during the project. I'll just give one example. This is only one out of several tools, but there's leaching tests that can be done with the sediments, including those that are at depth, to test whether or not liberation of a different form of chemical like chromium would occur. So throughout the project, there's measures taken to prevent release of suspended sediments, to model how the small amount of sediments that are released to the harbor move, behave, partition in the environment, and what the effects are of those substances. So by no means does the project suggest that we should just let it happen as it may. It's the opposite. The controls are put in place to prevent unacceptable changes. That's probably the best short response I can give. I did want to follow up. I lost computer contact for a few minutes when the question was raised about the core data. It's a valid question. We've been adding cores incrementally to the project, and there's plans to collect even a few more. So maybe we can, outside this meeting, work on a way to set up a schedule for updating stakeholders on core data, because that is important. Like, as an example, again, only one example, in the most recent round of coring of Anglin Bay, we did uncover samples at depth. I believe they were roughly a half a meter below the surface, and they had substantially elevated PAH concentrations, well above the concentrations that I showed you earlier on the surface plots. So it's further evidence that high concentrations of certain constituents do remain to this day, and those concentrations could be exposed to the environment, not overnight, but through the course of biological, physical, and mechanical action. So I'll probably leave it at there because I risk getting in the weeds too much, but maybe my parting thought will be that we've taken down a lot of the questions that have been raised, and we can provide more specific answers. Some of them might be appropriate for an FAQ and uploaded to the website so that other people can read it, and then others might be more suited to one-on-one stakeholder engagement, so that some of the miscommunication about what we have, what we know, and how it's being incorporated in the design can be resolved early.
So maybe I'll add to that plug. I think we have certainly have communication and contact with a number of the members that spoke today. If you have spoken today and are not signed up for our stakeholder updates, you can send an email to the Kingston Inner Harbor email inbox. There is a website with that email on it as well. I believe the city and Paul have it in our presentation tonight. So if you're not connected to some of the larger groups like the Kingston Field Naturalists or the Friends of the Inner Harbor or some of the other groups we mentioned, you can get those up. And even if you are, you can get those updates directly by providing your email to that contact list. On the website as well is kind of the list of upcoming field studies. I think we had the coring on there some time ago, but we can certainly update that on the upcoming field studies. And then the list of reports, some of them are directly on the website that you can access through there. And then some of them are older and not translated, so we can provide those upon request as well. So just to highlight that we've put a lot out there tonight. It is a lot of information, but a lot of this is on the website, and we'll be updating it on the website. And we sincerely appreciate like how we started everybody's feedback into this process. We haven't been able to answer anything yet because we're still at the concept stage, but we are tracking these. We have made changes based on the feedback over the last 2.5 years, and we hope to kind of move the project to achieving that goal of reducing chemical risks and impacts while ensuring that the habitat and environment that is there, the sensitive features that are there, can be protected and even in some cases enhanced.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we're going to move to have a mover and a seconder. Oh, wait, Paul McClatchy had something to say.
If I may, through you, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to add some context to the whole discussion here and shine a light on the recommendation that's before the committee in the staff report, in that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered for this project, and we've heard that they can be answered, but at later stages of the project, and that right now, what we're asking is that the city be permitted to continue to dialogue with the federal project so that we gain that understanding as they gain that understanding, and we can better advise this committee and council on what the implications of participating might be at a future date. So no commitment from the city for anything other than continuing to engage.
Okay, anybody else wanted to add anything? No? Okay, can I get a mover? Moved by Councillor Tozo, seconded by Councillor Amos. All in so any discussion? Councillor Tozo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you, and I won't be calling the question because we're here right now. I think recognizing the stage that we're at, that we still have a long way to go, is I think the first thing to recognize. Thank you to the people from the federal government. You guys gave a really great, thorough presentation, answered questions, and it was quite impressive. I will say that in my time on council, getting the province and the federal government to commit over $70 million to anything is impressive. I think the city is always in a beneficial position to be at the table and to participate in that dialogue of cleaning up an industrial harm that has been done. I'm in favor of this tonight. Let's move this forward. Let's keep the conversation going. And when we actually are at a decision point and we do more consultation, particularly with our Kingston's Indigenous counterparts and a nation-to-nation relationship, at that point, when we come to a final decision of what we have to do in committing our resources, I think it's valuable at that time to then have a more fulsome discussion of where we are with the community when we have this fully costed out especially. But right now, I'm comfortable to support this to continue that dialogue. And I'd encourage everybody else to do so. Thank you.
Anyone else wishes to speak? Councillor Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, yes. I will echo Councillor Tozo, the same thing. I was just talking to him earlier that when I read the report, it was my understanding that tonight we're just discussing about if we can allow the city staff to continue the conversation. But this meeting gone almost more than 3 hours long, and we're discussing all these questions. I'm sure down the road we'll come back again. But we spend the time here. I appreciate the staff and the federal government counterpart staffs to bring this all the information. And I think we should allow the city staff to go ahead and continue this conversation. Down the road, it seems to be a lot of a good benefit for the city and the Kingstonians as well. And I'm agree with the Councillor Toza, and I have no problem support to allow the city staff to continue the conversation. Explore more with this hope from the both sides that all the stakeholders who has the concerns and issues with this project, they will be taken into consideration and accommodate their concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. I think tonight we've heard some very real concerns, and I think we've also heard some excellent questions from people who are able to think really deeply on this, what it means now, what it means for the future. And I think it's really critical, and I really hope that the federal team and city staff have heard that this project, in terms of impact on all our relations, and part of our relations are water, right? Rocks, sediment, like all of this stuff, all of this part of the natural system is really important. It's not just about humans. It's not just about, us swimming or anchoring boats. It's bigger than that. So I'm of the opinion that we, as a city, are better to stay close to this project, because while we are not making a very real decision tonight, a very real decision is coming in the future, and we need all of that information. And so help me, if it's not pointing us in a clean, clear direction, I probably would not be supporting that in the future. I will support tonight because all of these excellent questions need to be answered. And the only way I think we can do that is by doing that detailed impact assessment and moving forward. So I'm very curious to see what does come of this. Again, the project sort of on its own at a high level, it makes absolute sense. But again, we're talking about living systems here, water flow patterns, like it's incredibly complicated. And I just want to make sure that the work that is done right, so that we have all the information and we can make a really informed decision on what's best for not just the city, but again, the natural world, the Wolf Island, like the people down the river, all of these other things that are really, really important to consider, and where that sediment will end up going and how it's coming out. So thank you. I will be supporting this tonight, and I really do look forward to more detailed information going forward.
Thank you. Anyone else? No? You want to take the chair? I'll say something.
I have the chair, Councillor Chinani.
So I think it's, like everyone said, we're not making a decision on spending $10 million and dredging right now, that it's just us being part of the conversation. And I think it's important to be part of the conversation and part of the process, and as we get more information. So since we know more about our area than we live here and we know the environment, so it's really important for us to still be part of the conversation, and we will get more data back, and hopefully that we'll go through this again and have more details, and then we can make an informed decision when the time comes. So I will be supporting this.
The chair is back to you.
Okay, so I call to a vote. All in favor? And And that passes unanimously. Okay, so now there are no motions. There are no notices of motions. There's no other business. There has been correspondence that we received. So the date of the next meeting of the Environment, Infrastructure, and Transportation Policies Committee is a special meeting scheduled for Tuesday, May 28th, 2024 at 6 p.m. Can I have a mover and seconder for adjournment? Moved by Councillor Shaves, seconded by Councillor Hassan. All in favor? Okay, good. Okay, good night, everyone.